The last first-class monster on Earth was the Ice Queen, who was very powerful and strong. The guy who wanted to fight this monster was among the final 5 players. This man managed to defeat the Ice Queen with great difficulty, and it took a lot of effort. The guy suddenly received a system notification stating that his body would enter a state of hibernation until he completely absorbed the Ice Queen's core. As a result of this battle, the guy fell into hibernation for a very long time. 25 years after the guy woke up, something he never expected awaited him. It was the frozen statues of his friends with whom he had fought in battle. However, after that, he received a notification confirming that he had acquired the freezing skill. This meant that the guy could remove the ice covering the frozen figures, and it was the only way to save his frozen comrades. The guy acquired this freezing skill after defeating the Ice Queen. It was known that monsters lived in the gates, and they were not easy to deal with. Demons were also present in these gates, threatening the lives of many people. Not long ago, first-class monsters appeared there, which were practically invincible. Some people made it their goal to defeat all these threats at any cost, so that the rest could live in peace. The young player knew very well that only after destroying all the approaching enemies could things get better, and only after he regained his lost abilities would he be able to rescue his friends from their icy imprisonment. That is why the guy made the difficult decision to leave behind his name as a dark ghost. This name had already become legendary in recent times, but he still decided to head back to the gates. The guy decided to become, so to speak, a new player, and for this reason he changed his name, which from now on would be known to everyone as So Junho. The guy met face-to-face with the Ice Queen in a deserted castle that was completely covered in ice. The queen knew that the guy had abandoned his comrades in a very dangerous place just to get here, and she was curious to know how he felt. He did not respond to her words about the dangerous place because he was confident in his comrades, who were not so easy to defeat. Besides, the guy was sure that it would all be over as soon as he destroyed the Ice Queen. The queen just laughed at this statement and realized that the guy probably knew nothing about this world. That's why he told the ice monster to shut up and stop talking nonsense, because now was definitely not the time for such meaningless conversations. The guy was determined to send this Ice Queen to the other world at any cost, and then the whole nightmare would finally be over. He didn't waste any more time talking and rushed into the attack, and the Ice Queen was completely in agreement with him on this. Each of them was good in their own way, and they both masterfully wielded their weapons. Their battle looked very impressive from the sidelines, and at one point, the guy managed to land a very powerful attack on the Ice Queen. After a short time, the Ice Palace didn't look so great anymore, as almost everything in it had been destroyed, and the two rivals stood facing each other. The queen looked happy, and even enjoyed everything they were doing. The guy couldn't boast about it, though, because he wasn't really enjoying it. He suddenly decided that it was time to end it all, and struck the queen, who was unable to dodge the blow and was ultimately defeated. At that moment, he received a system notification stating that he had begun to absorb the Ice Queen's power. His body would soon enter a state of hibernation until he had completely absorbed the Ice Queen's core. Shortly before, the last dungeon there had been discovered, and it was the Ice Queen's lair. The man was very angry that after going through all this trouble to get here, it turned out that everyone else would simply die. The group learned that only one person could climb the stairs. The girl tried to calm the man, whose name was Callie. She believed that they didn't have much time, and therefore had to make a careful decision. She believed that this person should be the gloomy ghost. The guy tried to argue with her and convince the girl named Sky otherwise. However, he was interrupted by another man who said he completely agreed with Sky's decision. He believed that they would be at a disadvantage if they went up against an opponent with icy abilities. Callie was angry that he couldn't go himself, but he admitted that there was no one better than a gloomy character, so he agreed. Another girl decided that since Callie had agreed so quickly, they could assume that they all shared the same opinion. She decided to clarify that if anyone else hadn't understood, she also thought that the gloomy ghost should go. Their small but very friendly group ultimately came to a unanimous decision. The gloomy ghost hoped that they would not regret it, to which one of the guys replied that if he failed to defeat the Ice Queen and they all ended up in the afterlife, they would most likely regret it. However, despite all this, they completely trusted the gloomy ghost and were confident in their decision. Sky had no doubt that the guy would do everything to prevent that from happening. The guys decided that the conversation was over, and repeated once again that they all believed and trusted the gloomy ghost. 25 years later, in the year 2024, a monster appeared that humanity was unable to defeat. It was announced from a large stage that the Ice Queen who had frozen the Pacific Ocean with a single wave of her hand was an unusual monster. After her appearance, many lost hope, and only 5 brave souls decided to go to the South Pole. One of the boys shouted that the guys had gone to the South Pole to conquer the nest. The response was that this was indeed the case. and the boy was praised for being very smart for his age. It was said that these boys were legendary players who had accomplished the greatest feats in the history of mankind. A few minutes later, the people they were talking about appeared on stage. Nowadays, all these guys are called the 5 heroes, and the woman asked everyone to show them respect. It was also said that thanks to the heroes defeating the Ice Queen, many safe zones had appeared on Earth. At that moment, something began to happen with the ice hand. The boy jumped up from his seat and shouted to the entire hall that the ice statue had just moved. The woman smiled and replied to the boy that unfortunately, he was mistaken this time, as such a thing was simply impossible. It was impossible because the internal temperature of this reinforced glass wall was controlled around the clock. Such strict control was in place to prevent damage to the ice statues. That is why everyone was absolutely certain that nothing would happen to them. However, a moment later, something unexpected happened. One of the ice statues began to crack. A system notification lit up indicating that the absorption level had reached 100%. One of the famous 5 players was lying on the floor. The guy felt a wild cold covering every inch of his body. He received a notification that since he had absorbed the Ice Queen's core, he had acquired a new ability, freezing. The guy looked around. The first thing he wanted to understand was what was going on here. After some time in the hospital, the guy looked at the latest news, which said that after 25 years, a gloomy ghost had emerged from cryogenic sleep. The guy assumed that he had no strength at all because he had been frozen for such a long time. He couldn't even clench his hand into a fist. It was no surprise that his whole body was still shaking so badly, as 25 years had passed. The doctor who entered addressed the gloomy ghost and informed him that the president of the Players Association was on his way. The young man immediately warned that if he didn't know him, he should turn around and leave, as he didn't like anyone bothering. The doctor replied that this man had always spoken of him as a close friend. The gloomy ghost thought about it, as there were not many people who could call him their friend, so he thanked the doctor and said that he would recognize him when he met him. He couldn't help but notice that the world had truly changed, and that was exactly what the gloomy ghost had always strived for. The young man remembered that all his comrades who wanted to see this world safe had strived for this goal. The gloomy ghost tried to figure out what to do now, since all he really knew how to do was fight. From all this, one conclusion could be drawn. The guy was now unemployed. Therefore, he decided that no matter what happened next, he could no longer wear a mask. The doctor and the rest of the staff were shocked and did not understand why the gloomy ghost had taken off his mask. The guy replied that he had taken off the mask because they all now lived in a safe world, and heroes were no longer needed. He looked at the doctor and couldn't understand why they had such a strange reaction and what it all meant. A man accompanied by 2 people entered the ward and asked to be allowed to explain everything. The gloomy ghost was very surprised when he saw the man and immediately asked if he was Toku. The man in the suit smiled and asked everyone to leave him alone with the gloomy figure. The president of the Players Association said that Jun-ho hadn't changed at all during that time. Upon hearing the man's voice, Jun was certain that it was Toku standing before him. The young man even began to laugh because he had always said that the man would develop a bald spot in the shape of the letter M. Toku wasn't very surprised that the guy couldn't say anything else after so many years, and in principle, he didn't really expect a touching reunion. Jun started laughing again, realizing that 25 years had passed and, judging by the looks of it, no cure for baldness had been found. He also said that Toku hadn't changed much either, except for his appearance, of course. The guy first asked Toku why the doctors had reacted that way, since everything was already over. He didn't understand why they were so concerned back then. The man replied that 25 years ago, at the moment when he and his friends managed to conquer the Queen's Nest, all the players received the same notification. The notification said that the Ice Queen had been defeated and that safe zones were appearing on Earth. At that moment, people all over the world hugged each other, laughed, and cried with joy. However, this world did not allow the joy to last even a minute, as a notification arrived stating that an interdimensional elevator had been installed in the Pacific Ocean. This was the 2nd floor, and now it was possible to travel to the interdimensional zone. People did not understand what this meant, and were outraged because the destruction of the Ice Queen was not the end of all this horror. The notification also stated that it was necessary to try to reach the top floor. After that, all the world's players, associations, and politicians gathered together to hold a meeting. As a result of the protracted meeting, it was decided to send an advance group to the border zone. Thus, the 2nd floor became their land of opportunity. Humanity was able to not only master magic and technology, but also gain access to a vast amount of resources and knowledge. The man added that thanks to all this, a land of plenty had emerged, but the guy stopped him and said that this was not what he wanted to know. Toku understood and began to explain that there were buttons for the 1st to 10th floors in the interdimensional elevator. He said that it took them 5 years to defeat the Ice Queen. Jun thought that after 25 years, given that they had managed to clear 5 floors, they must now be on the 7th floor. However, he understood that compared to his team, the other players were much lower level, so only the 5 of them went to the South Pole, and if he was being realistic, they should still be on the 5th floor. He didn't want to guess anymore and asked the man how many floors they had already managed to take over. Jun became very serious because the man was in no hurry to answer his question, and this was very suspicious. Toku plucked up his courage and said that in the last 25 years, humanity had only been able to take over 2 floors. Jun simply grabbed his head when he heard his friend's answer and said that he had nothing to say about it. He couldn't understand how, in such an impressive period of time, they had only managed to reach the 2nd floor. Toku replied that it certainly sounded like an excuse, but there were reasons for it. Jun, of course, wanted to hear it, simply because he was at least curious to know the reason. The man said that it was all connected to the Ice Queen's core, and that was their main reason. Jun immediately fell silent as he began to guess what was going on. Toku continued, saying that the environment on the 3rd floor was very similar to a volcanic zone. Therefore, only a few players who were more resistant to the heat of the magma could go there. He also said that after some time, on the 3rd floor, in the middle of a lava ocean, they found an altar that required the Ice Queen's core to cool the environment. Jun decided to ask if they had been able to find the core or not. Toku grabbed his head, ashamed to admit it. The man said that they had searched the Queen's nest tens of thousands of times but couldn't find anything. This was not surprising to Jun, as he had swallowed the Ice Queen's core himself. The guy tried to calm his friend down and said that they were just unlucky, and that anyone could make a mistake. Jun believed that they should be understanding towards each other. He also said that if he ever made a mistake, he hoped Toku would try to understand him too. Toku immediately replied to his friend that there was no question of that, because of course he would always be understanding. Jun thought about it and couldn't figure out when the right moment would come for him to hear less indignation in response to his story. Toku only now realized how much time had passed and asked his friend if he was hungry. Jun showed him an advertisement for a rural history museum where 5 sleeping heroes were on display, and asked if it was really that popular. Toku said he was going to the 1st floor, but there were a lot of people and journalists there, so he didn't think it was a good idea to go down there together. Jun realized that he could go alone through the emergency exit, but Toku asked him to return to the hospital immediately afterward. The guy went down to the museum and saw some exhibits there and did not expect to see such things in this place. Jun finally managed to find the room he was looking for and was slightly excited about it. The guy sat down opposite his friends and first apologized for coming so late. He talked to the guys about everything he had learned and told them that the world had become a better place, and that they had managed to protect the world they had dreamed of. Jun felt sad for his friends, and didn't know how to fix the situation, or how he could help. Suddenly, the guy looked closely at the statues and saw how much dust was on them. He wanted to fix it, and as soon as he touched them, he received a notification that his freezing skill had been confirmed. However, it also said that his magic parameters were insufficient, and therefore he was unable to remove the ice cover. Jun saw another system notification saying that with the freeze skill, he could remove the ice cover from the frozen figure. The guy couldn't even imagine that he could remove the ice cover and bring his companions back to life. However, he saw that his magic power was very low and thought that perhaps this had been done on purpose. The guy figured that it would take him a day or 2 to recover, but it was still doable. He remembered how Toku always said that there was nothing above level C, so the guy assumed that maybe he was the first one with a problem with magic. He had probably received this title after defeating the Ice Queen. Jun realized that every time he went up 1 floor in the interdimensional elevator, all his stats would increase by 30 points. Jun figured that with this effect, if he kept going up floors, he could get his level back. This way, he would not only significantly improve his abilities, but also completely subdue the Ice Queen's power. After that, the guy would be able to melt the ice and save all his friends. Jun asked his friends to wait a little longer and promised he would definitely get them out of there. The guy then told Toku that he wanted to return as a player, and didn't understand why he was so surprised. Jun believed that his friend already knew that he was incapable of anything else. For Toku, this was all too unexpected, because before Jun had done nothing but talk about his desire to retire. The guy replied that it was all 25 years ago. Toku thought about it for a while and said that in any case, he didn't think it was a very good idea. The man believed that the young man needed to rest well first and not make any important decisions yet. Jun wanted to understand why his friend was so against it, and only then did Toku decide to tell him that it was all because of the demons. He told him that there were players who used their awakened powers to satisfy their own desires. It was known that they were involved in illegal activities, more specifically, destruction and terrorism. These players were a big problem and a threat to society. Jun realized that these players had reappeared, even though they couldn't do anything while he was around. Toku said that starting from the 2nd floor, there were no surveillance cameras or satellites installed. In addition, no country had the resources to suppress the demons, and apparently they had gotten a taste of life. Jun now understood why his friend Toku was so against his return. The guy didn't think that they still disliked him, to put it mildly, and that the mere thought of his destruction would most likely bring them to complete ecstasy. That's why Toku believed that the guy should just forget about the idea. The guy, however, thought that the only way to return safely was to leave behind the name of the grim ghost and go by his own name, So Jun-ho. Jun wanted to do all this so that he could get to the 10th floor. Togu wanted to know why the guy suddenly had such a desire, and then Jun replied that there was a volcanic zone on the 3rd floor, and Togu himself had told him that there was no way to pass that floor. Suddenly, the guy thought about everything he had eaten and then said that he probably had one way. Toku, unable to contain his emotions, lunged at the guy, trying to find out as quickly as possible what method he was talking about. Jun replied that he needed the Ice Queen's core. Jun then said that he had eaten it, but Toku thought that the guy was talking about eating the Solentang. However, Jun wasn't talking about food, and only now did Toku begin to understand. The man realized that the guy had eaten the Ice Queen's core. In his defense, Jun began to say that he didn't want to consume it. He said that as soon as he defeated the Ice Queen, the core absorbed itself into him, and he couldn't do anything about it. Toku grabbed his head and said that all of this must have caused his blood pressure to skyrocket. Jun believed that this was how he had gained his freezing ability. The man realized that with this ability, the guy would be able to cool down even the heat of the 3rd floor. Toku also realized that the reason for Jun's return was directly related to his friend. In any case, after calming down a little, the man began to realize that this was good news after all. Togu decided that in that case, he would first deal with the doctors who had seen his face, as that was the least he could do for the boy. Jun remembered and decided to tell his friend that his level had been reset, and that he was now at the 1st level. The guy also asked Togu to get him a new player license. Togu only now realized that he had forgotten to tell the guy about this, because guilds had now become more powerful than association. In large guilds, it was now customary to take the exams in person to obtain a license. Now, the guy's license could only be confirmed if he passed an open exam. Togu told the guy that unfortunately he couldn't help him with this, and that Jun would have to resolve the issue on his own. However, the man believed that this was actually a great opportunity for his friend, because they needed a reason if they were going to support him completely. Toku said that, in other words, the young man needed to get the best results, so that everyone would want to take him under their wing. Jun replied that he understood, and was looking forward to proving himself in the exam. In one of the city buildings, there was a players' association, and this was where the exam for obtaining a license was held. You could see your number on the board, and Jun, looking at it all, realized that a lot of money had been spent here. The administrator kept order and told people to wait outside the door until they were called. The guy appreciated the atmosphere inside, which was quite relaxed. Jun waited sitting on a chair and watched everyone as his turn was still a long way off. The guy decided that while he was waiting, he could listen to what the other participants were talking about. To do this, Jun used his Dark Guardian skill, which helped improve his hearing. The guy heard someone talking about the morning news, which reported that the ancient dungeon on the 2nd floor had finally been conquered. He also heard that today's examiner would be the president of the association, Shim Togu himself. Jun couldn't overhear anything else, as all the conversations sounded quite peaceful. The board suddenly lit up, and candidate number 1 was called to take the exam. Everyone could watch the practical part of the exam on the screen, where candidate number 1 was about to fight his opponents. One of the guys who was closely watching the candidate noticed that he had an impressive fighting spirit. They noticed that the monsters were afraid of their opponent and began to retreat. This same guy was sure that the man on the screen would easily pass his exam and even envied him a little. Jun, however, was not so sure, because he knew that if you want to secure the space around you, a spear is of course ideal for this. However, the guy also knew that when his opponent started to approach, he shouldn't wave the spear around, because that would only make things worse. These words were confirmed a few minutes later when it was announced that participant number 1 had failed his exam. Jun realized that, judging by all appearances, everything would continue in the same vein, following a similar scenario. The examiner saw that the next number was 75, and this was finally the last participant, which meant that they were almost done. Unfortunately, they noted that none of the participants had impressed them today, and that none of them met the basic requirements. The president said that he wanted to finish quickly, and was waiting for the next participant. After participant number 75 entered, all the examiners could not hide their surprise. They couldn't understand who this man was who had brought a sword, a bow, metal knives, and even a spear with him. They got the impression that this participant had decided to bring his entire arsenal with him. One of the men thought this guy was too skinny, and was sure that this participant would hardly be able to take care of himself. The woman, however, saw in this participant another imitator of a gloomy ghost, and this clearly did not inspire her with joy. The president of the association thought that he had certainly asked Jun to stand out in some way, but he didn't think it would be to this extent. The man was almost certain that an entertaining spectacle awaited them. The guy walked out with a confident stride, armed with everything he had, and looked very impressive. The examiners asked participant number 75, So Jun-ho, if he was ready to begin, and received an affirmative answer. The exam began, and at that moment, silhouettes of various monsters appeared, which the guy had to fight. Jun saw dwarves in front of him, whose average height was about 130 centimeters, and he knew that dwarves were physically inferior to the average man. There were 20 dwarves standing in front of him, and they looked quite realistic up close. The whole situation reminded the guy of his old days, and he didn't mind reliving them. These strange dwarf monsters received the command to attack, and immediately all rushed at the guy. Using his entire arsenal of weapons, Jun skillfully dealt with and destroyed his opponents one by one. The guy noticed that as soon as he destroyed one dwarf, another one appeared. Jun couldn't understand the point of this battle. The guy suddenly sensed danger behind him and reacted in time. He was slightly annoyed that these creatures were trying to attack him from behind. Jun decided to use his bow, and seeing that the monsters were scattering, told them that it was a futile endeavor. The guy said this confidently because he had been taught how to shoot a bow by a famous skilled archer. That archer was Gilbert Green, and he was indeed a master of this weapon. Then the guy took out his sword and decided that this type of weapon would be his last. One of the dwarves, wasting no time, rushed at the guy at full speed, trying to hit him. The monsters wanted to win by outnumbering him, so they all attacked the guy at once from all sides. Jun had to admit that he was a master with his sword, and skillfully fought off these creatures, destroying them one by one. Suddenly, the guy felt a strong discomfort and aching all over his body. After a while, participant number 75, So Jun-ho, was announced as having passed the exam. The guy realized that he definitely needed to work on his physical training. The female examiner admitted that her eyes had deceived her, because this guy was not just another imitator of a gloomy ghost. The guy was impressed by how skillfully the participant wielded a spear and threw knives, as well as how accurately he shot a bow, and even his fencing skills were top-notch. The examiner was simply amazed at how skillfully the guy handled his weapons. Another man simply did not expect the participant to be able to do such things with his thin body. However, after they looked at the guy's profile, they saw that his only skill was weapon mastery, and realized that he was at level D. Therefore, they were very surprised that this was not even his secondary skill, because if he only had one D-level skill, it was obvious that training him would be useless. They knew that as his level increased, there would likely be too many restrictions. They considered Jun's combat skills to be quite remarkable, but unfortunately, they were not worth their investment. The examiners knew that they had to avoid losses as much as possible, as there was no need to take the difficult path. The president of the association realized that there should be no problems with Jun joining the Players Association. The man decided that the decision had been made and was glad that everything had turned out that way. The only thing he felt guilty about was faking the guy's profile. After all this, Jun lay on the couch and read what he thought was an unrealistically funny novel. He read about how the most respected player in the world, who ranked first, was a player whom everyone looked up to, and that person was the very same ghost. Toku grabbed his head and repeated that he needed to be patient, and that was the most important thing at the moment. The man turned to his friend Jun to find out what was so interesting that the guy was reading. Jun replied that he was reading a novel in which the main character was a priest, but they were just fighting instead of healing. Toku thought they were out of their minds and didn't understand why the guy was wasting his time on it. The man told his friend to stop reading and asked to see the materials Jun had requested. Toku didn't understand why the guy had asked for information about the unconquered gates, and hoped that Jun wasn't planning to go there with his level. Jun replied that he was indeed planning to go. Otherwise, why would he have requested the materials in the first place? Toku reminded his friend that no one had ever conquered them, and he really hoped that the guy understood what that meant. Jun still remembered that the gates were filled with various traps and monsters that attacked everyone indiscriminately. Nothing remained of the players who had tried to conquer them. That was why the gates that had never been captured were called unconquered gates. It was known that only beginners could enter these gates, which made them even more dangerous, and high-level players were forbidden from entering. Beginners went there to level up, but ended up dying with the rest of their team. Toku thought that this was going too far, because it was very stupid to go to the unconquered gates in such a state. Jun replied that his friend shouldn't worry so much, and that besides, these unconquered gates were just a headache for the association. The man confirmed all this and was well aware of everything, but he couldn't send his friend to such a dangerous place. Jun replied that he would avoid the emotional moment and simply say that he would go there anyway because it would be useful for him. The man looked a little confused because he didn't understand what benefit he was talking about. Then Jun explained that over time, the rewards at the gates increase. Over the years, the gates had been conquered, and therefore the guy believed he could earn a huge amount of experience points. Toku now understood why his friend had chosen this place to increase his level. The man immediately became angry because Jun had apparently already forgotten how he had died and been resurrected. Toku believed that there were safer ways to increase one's level. Juna became more serious and said that his companions were still in icy confinement, waiting for him to free them. The guy was sure that his companions would do the same. He believed that it was not necessary to choose the thorny path, and besides, that was not the only reason for him. The guy knew that sooner or later he would have to face the demons head-on, as time was definitely not on his side. Jun had to be strong enough to fight back when he met them. Toku didn't even think about it, and the man couldn't even imagine that his friend was feeling such intense pressure. The guy wouldn't call it pressure, but he thought it was better that Toku didn't know about it. The man finally decided to try to find out everything he could about the gates that Jun could enter. Toku learned that with his level, Jun could only enter gates that had not been conquered. The man told him that they had appeared 7 years ago, and that since then, 142 people had tried to capture them, but had been destroyed by monsters. Toku said that only first-level players could enter, which is why the place was called the Tomb of Newbies. Jun learned that the conditions for capturing the gates were not that difficult. The man received a notification that Jun's deposit had arrived, which was good news. Toku believed that since the boy now officially belonged to the association, Jun was his subordinate for the entire next year. Jun laughed and replied to his master that he would definitely show him what a loyal subordinate should really look like. The guy decided to ask his friend about the house and find out if he could just stay there. He knew, of course, that the association had a separate building for players, but he wanted to stay there anyway. Toku thought it was a good idea because the guy would be safer in this house, and if everything went well, he might even give Jun a whole floor. Jun believed that it would no longer be up to him. The man pointed to a box and asked the young man to open it, as it contained his uniform. When Jun opened the box, he saw the uniform, which was surprisingly light and elastic. Toku admitted that this uniform was a masterpiece by Kwon Noya himself. Jun did not expect to hear that the old man was still alive. The man replied that Kwon would turn 98 this year, which was a respectable age. Toku said that Kwon had passed his workshop on to his grandson, but still worked there. Jun decided that in that case he must stop by and say hello. The man replied that for his own safety, he should be wary of such situations. The guy thought that Toku must suspect Kwon Noya. Toku replied that he didn't suspect him at all, but thought it wasn't worth visiting the old man anyway. Jun realized that this meant they were watching the workshop, and that didn't bode well. This was all because the demons knew very well about the relationship between the gloomy ghost and Kwon. Therefore, Toku believed that if the young man met with the old man, he would reveal his true identity. Jun understood that his friend was right, because if he, as a newcomer, went abroad to meet Kwon no Yum, people would definitely suspect something was wrong. Toku said that he had already informed the old man through their employee about their current situation, so he should understand. The young man needed to become stronger first, and he needed to do it as soon as possible. Jun asked his friend to thank Kwon No for getting him in such great shape. The guy tried to figure out which weapon would be best for him, to which Toku replied that there were much better weapons in the association's warehouse, and that the guy could choose anyone he liked. The man only warned Jun not to start comparing these weapons to Kwon Noa's masterpieces. Jun initially wanted to go straight to the capture, but decided that he needed to train first. The guy remembered how exhausting the usual exam had been, so he understood that without sufficient physical training, he would not be able to fight monsters or demons. Toku believed that his friend had made the right decision and thought that it would take the young man about a month to prepare, but Jun replied that 10 days would be enough. 10 days later, in the city of Namyangju on Mount Cheonma, a sign was erected saying, "Passage closed." The young man stood before the gates known as the Curse of Dawn. He was given a condition of surrender, which was to hold out until dawn. As soon as he entered, he immediately found himself on the other side, where the outside world looked completely different. Jun also realized that for some reason he felt surprisingly comfortable in this place. The guy began to think that he was slowly losing his mind, since such a place seemed cozy to him. He saw the conditions of his capture in a system notification, and realized that judging by this information, the conditions were not that difficult. His main goal was just to hold out until dawn, and he decided that he had arrived at just the right time. After studying the materials, the guy discovered that the teams that entered early in the morning were able to hold out in this place longer than anyone else. Juna also knew that time inside the gate was completely different. Teams entering in the afternoon did not have time to adjust to the time distortion and, in all likelihood, had to fight immediately. As a result, these teams found themselves in a hopeless situation, as all the players were exclusively first level and below. However, he had prepared thoroughly and was now in top form, waiting for the creatures of this place to show what they were capable of. Jun sat leaning against a tree reading a book, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by those who had long since passed away. The guy figured it might be some kind of evil spirit, and he was starting to get tired of the whole situation. A moment later, what the guy had been expecting happened. Evil spirits emerged from the ground and grabbed Jun by the leg. June smiled and told the evil spirits not to come out and advised them to stay where they were. The guy also felt that there were a lot of these creatures in this place. The guy received a system notification that night had fallen, and his night hunter skill had been activated, so all his senses became heightened. Jun looked around and realized that these creatures were everywhere, and there were a lot of them. It was quite difficult for beginners to deal with evil spirits, especially if they were zombies. This was because these creatures felt no pain, and it was impossible to land a single decisive blow on them. These creatures paid no attention to the damage they received and focused solely on attacking. The undead were excellent at causing panic among newbies who did not yet have any developed abilities. The guy now understood why this place was called the Tomb of Newbies, because it was really tough here. However, Jun had already had similar experiences before and was now strong enough not to fall because of something like this. It was not easy for the guy to deal with all these undead creatures, and he really hoped that they would not appear again. Jun tried to pull himself together and suddenly heard a strange sound, or rather a voice. The guy heard that, judging by the voice, there was a person somewhere nearby, and Jun now tried to find him. Jun reached the place where the sound was coming from and assumed that the person he was looking for was underground. While digging, the guy asked how they got there, and the voice replied that he had trusted his friends and followed them here, and as a result, everyone had been destroyed except him. The voice began to whimper and begged the guy to help him finally get out of there. Jun replied that he would definitely help, but asked him to shout very loudly first. The voice didn't understand why he had to shout, to which the guy replied that the shout would help him determine his exact location. After a loud scream was heard and the guy found the right place, Jun didn't waste any more time and used his weapon, which was aimed at the tomb. Until then, Jun had been wondering how these gates had managed to kill more than 100 people so easily. Now he understood who the voice belonged to and who had created this tomb for newcomers. At that moment, the one who had been speaking all this time emerged from the tomb, and it was a very large monster, a deceiver. The monster wanted to know and understand how the guy had found out about him, but Jun was in no hurry to answer as he was busy destroying the creature, and only then said that it was impossible for anyone to have survived in the unconquered gates. It was known that after the gates were captured, they could not even open if even one living player remained inside. The guy realized that the previous players must have known this too, but sometimes people still acted on autopilot. For Jun, this was not surprising, and even if you took into account all the zombies, it still wouldn't have been that difficult to defeat them. But the whole reason lay in the deceiver. The guy looked at the system notification and saw that all the monsters had been destroyed, and he was able to successfully overcome the Curse of Dawn. Jun ended up leveling up 4 times, and even though his stats didn't go up much, he was still happy with the result. As a reward for his victory, Jun also gained a new ability, the Confession of Those Who Had Passed Away. The guy was delighted to have acquired a new skill that allowed him to look into the memories of those who had passed away. Of course, he wanted more, but the ability to see the memories of those who were no longer with him could also come in handy. Jun thought that he probably got this skill for defeating the deceitful monster. The conditions for using this skill were quite specific, but the guy was sure that it would come in handy someday. The guy already had a power that he had obtained as a player, so Jun-ho, and not as a dark sign. Jun was eagerly awaiting the upcoming events and believed he was ready for them. Taku, at home, was reading the latest newspaper and simply couldn't believe it. The man said that since his friend's return, the world had been in an uproar, and there hadn't been a single peaceful day. Jun smiled and replied that this was probably why Taku was beaming with happiness. The man simply found it very amusing to watch all those arrogant people from the guild get nervous. For Jun, it was no surprise, as the guild would not risk revealing the information. The guy didn't understand why the journalists were stirring things up, and also believed that it wasn't time for him to reveal his identity yet. Togu was sure that if everyone found out that he was the one who had captured the gate, the guy would definitely become very sought after. Jun said that people buy luxury items even if they are made in the same factory because they are expensive and special, and not everyone can afford them. Toku decided that the guy had probably just decided to become a luxury item. Jun, however, wanted to be not just an expensive item, but something that everyone would want to possess. Yet no one knew where to get it. Therefore, Jun wanted to become a legendary limited edition. The man finally understood that his friend just wanted to stir up public interest, and he also realized that sometimes the guy's bad personality came out. Jun replied that his friend understood him correctly, but he felt he couldn't keep them waiting so long. He was sure that smart people would figure out that this guy could show up at other unconquered gates. That's why reporters would be waiting for him to show up at the unconquered gates. Jun believed that even if that happened, he still wasn't obligated to reveal himself, as he believed that the world should gradually learn everything on its own. Toku couldn't understand when his friend had started to worry so much about formalities. Jun continued to train hard because he understood that he needed to improve his physical condition. The training was not as easy as he had expected, but he had no intention of giving up. Thanks to his persistence in training, the guy managed to increase his strength by 1 point and began to feel more alive. Jun looked at his profile and saw information about the Lufo Garden. It was the oldest unconquered gate in Korea, which had appeared 9 years ago. It was known that if these gates were left alone for a long time, monsters would start to emerge from them and destroy ordinary people, and such gates were called open gates. The government and the association offered a huge reward for the capture of the Lufo Garden, so players from their country risked everything to capture it. However, there were 124 attempts and just as many failures. That is why the government had no choice but to seek help abroad. They spent a fortune to hire a super recruit from India named Tichara Vichy. This man had a natural talent and was also a skilled archer. Jun believed that in terms of potential, this guy could easily match 5 Gilbert Greens, or even surpass them. However, Tichara Vichy was defeated, and everyone lost hope that the Lufo Garden would ever be captured. As a result, a 22-year-old player with a bright future met his end. Reading about all this, Jun thought that it was all very unfortunate, but he also understood that he could have been in that guy's place. The guy believed that this was why he needed to approach his training even more carefully. With the help of physical exercises, Jun was able to raise his scores to 30 and thought that such scores were high enough for his level. However, Jun understood that even if Tichara, a rising star, failed to capture the gate, he could not rule out the possibility of a hidden trap in these gates. The guy planned to think through all possible scenarios during his training. Jun had also become somewhat accustomed to using his freezing skill, and now he was curious to see how much this skill could help him in a real battle. The guy arrived at the location and found himself in the territory of the Lufo Garden, which had to be admitted was very beautiful. The necessary condition for these gates was to destroy absolutely all the monsters. The guy had no idea how many monsters were waiting for him there, but considering that teams of 4 had failed, it meant that there was some kind of hidden trap that had taken them all out. Jun suddenly saw something in front of him that looked like a huge maze. The guy decided that for starters, he needed to stay as far away from this suspicious area as possible. He knew that the monsters would appear at night, so now he could just relax and wait. Jun simply knew that all these monsters were nocturnal. As night fell, just as the guy had expected, those he had to fight appeared. Jun wouldn't have minded if these creatures had warned him of their arrival. As night fell, all of the guy's senses sharpened. The guy saw that there were only 2 of these monsters and was surprised that there were so few of them. The monsters decided to attack their guest immediately and were confident that they would destroy the guy in no time. Jun didn't just stand there either, but tried to dodge the attack and strike back at these creatures. The guy wielded his weapon very skillfully and looked very impressive. A few minutes later, a powerful explosion occurred at the battle site, blinding everything around it. The guy was unharmed, but the same could not be said for the 2 creatures that Jun had destroyed. Jun appraised his weapon with dignity, which he thought was simply amazing, because the Ice Queen's skill was very good. The guy thought for a moment, and after looking back, realized that apparently those 2 monsters weren't enough, as there was a whole horde of monsters behind him. Jun had no choice but to accept this and engage in battle with all these creatures. The guy continued to use the Ice Queen's skill to destroy one monster after another. He wasn't going to spare anyone, as he simply had to fulfill the condition he had been given. It wasn't easy for the guy, but he stubbornly kept moving forward and couldn't show any weakness. After a while, Jun completed his task, and there was not a single creature left near him. However, the guy was surprised that it was all over so quickly. As soon as Jun turned around, he saw an entire army of monsters. The guy couldn't understand how these creatures had managed to multiply so quickly, and noticed that there were at least twice as many monsters now. The guy began to realize that after he destroyed them, the number of monsters grew exponentially. Jun couldn't hide his irritation, but he didn't have much choice since he had to emerge victorious. One of the monsters used its abilities to try to destroy the guy. Jun fought back and skillfully dealt with all the attacks directed at him. These creatures surrounded the guy on all sides, and there were so many of them that Jun was now acting more on autopilot. After he had destroyed almost all of them, Jun realized how tired he was and had lost track of time. Of course, it was all very tiring for the guy, but not enough to fail the mission. However, something still bothered Jun, because he had excellent control over his first-class freezing ability, and that alarmed him. After all, if he could handle such a difficult level on his own, then 4 people should have been more than enough. Among the players who had been trying to capture these gates over the past 9 years were strong players with enormous potential. Tichara Vichy was one of the talented new recruits. Judging by what Jun had seen in the materials, Tichara could easily take out at least half of them on his own. If he had teammates with him, they would have definitely been able to capture the gate. That's why he couldn't understand why that guy failed the mission, and it was a big mystery to him. Jun fought hard, and after a short time, he received a system notification that he had finally managed to capture the Lufo Garden. The guy thought that his whole life had just flashed before his eyes. Jun was absolutely certain that as long as he was safe and sound, everything would be fine. However, he had to admit that at one point, He had even managed to completely despair. The guy still didn't understand how he had managed to do it, but now he was trying to figure out what kind of place he was in. June walked a little deeper into the maze and found the remains of the deceased. The guy also noticed countless traces of battles in this place, and realized that they had all tried to escape through a narrow passage, but in the end, this maze had only stolen their precious time. Judging by what he could see, June realized that none of them had been able to cope with the influx of monsters, and this place had turned out to be a dead end for Nick. The guy wandered through the maze and saw how many teams had been destroyed here, and it seemed that he had reached a dead end. Jun looked back and discovered the remains of another player in the corner of the maze, who was holding something interesting in his hands, which turned out to be a bow. The guy remembered some information from the materials and realized that it was a hurricane bow. Jun decided that it would be better to politely ask the guy who had already passed away to borrow the weapon for a while. He knew that if you shot this bow, the arrow would spin unpredictably in flight, like a butterfly. That is why people compared the wind created by the bow to the force of a hurricane, hence its name. The Indian government had given this bow to Ticharavishi, which is why Jun guessed whose remains he was now looking at. However, in addition to the bow, the boy saw something else, a book that looked very much like a diary. The young man was very curious to find out if the owner's name was written in this diary. Jun opened it and began to read the lines written on April 7, 2044, at 12:40 p.m. A guy named Ticharavishi was tasked with capturing the Lufo Garden in Korea. He was very happy to have been given such an honor and was ready to do everything in his power. His friend asked Tichara to think everything through very carefully, as the gate had not been captured for many years. The man warned the young man that because of all the danger, he might not return. Tichara replied that the Koreans had asked him personally for help, and he simply could not refuse them, as this would go against the teachings of Lord Vishnu. The guy was currently at the 10th level, and this was his only chance to get into the Lufu Garden. He felt that he simply had to do it. Tichara decided to check with the girl to see if she was sure she wanted to go with him, to which she replied that she would follow him there, of course. The girl believed in him and was ready to go anywhere with him. She added that if Tichara decided to go there alone, she would still find a way to get there. The girl was happy that the guy asked her to go with him. She was convinced that she simply had to protect him from any trouble. Tichara was very happy that his girlfriend Zaya was willing to go with him. There was no one the guy trusted more than this girl. Zaya was also Tichara's partner and was always ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with him. They were both sure that they would capture the gate no matter what. A little girl ran straight into the arms of her father, whom she loved very much. The child looked a little upset because she realized that her father was leaving again. The man told his daughter that he had to go to work, but promised her that he would return very soon. He asked the child to listen to her grandmother while he was gone. The girl replied that in that case, as soon as her father returned, they would definitely go together to look at the animal. The man promised to fulfill his daughter's wish and asked her to listen to her grandmother and eat well. Tichara stood a little to the side and watched this sweet scene, which evoked a lot of sentimentality. The young man apologized to the man for how things had turned out, as he could see how difficult it was for him to part with his daughter. The man admitted that this was his first time going on such a long business trip. However, he knew that everything would be fine since his daughter's grandmother would be staying with him. Besides, he had already promised to help his friend and had no intention of going back on his word or letting anyone down. Tichara was very grateful to his friend for this, as he knew how difficult it was for him to leave his child. The man believed that since he was on the same team as a rising star, he simply had to get his share, if only for the sake of his child. The guys arrived in New Delhi at Indira Gandhi International Airport. Tichara greeted another player who was also on their team, and the guy thanked him for coming after all. The next entry in the diary was made on April 23, 2044, at 4:12 p.m. Tichara was training hard and was very skilled with his bow. The guy knew that tomorrow they would be going to a place where it would not be easy for them, but today he admitted to himself that he was good with his weapon. Tichara was determined and, despite everything, had a good feeling about it. Finally, on April 24, 2044, at 11:37 a.m., they entered the Lufo Garden. Once there, Tichara looked around in awe and realized that he had never seen such gates before. The guy realized that they were still in the dungeon and therefore should not be distracted. Tichara thought it would be better to look around first. The next entry was made on the same day, but at 11:33 p.m., when the players first encountered the monster. However, they were surprised that there were only 8 creatures and did not understand why there were so few. Over time, the situation changed slightly, and there were now 32 monsters, all actively attacking the group. Tichara shouted to his companions to be as careful as possible. At one point, a man was unable to dodge an attack in time and was caught by one of the monsters. Tichara noticed this, but unfortunately, it was too late, and he was unable to protect his friend. He shouted to his friends to take the guy away from there and run into the maze as fast as they could. Techera noticed that every time they destroyed a monster, these creatures simply began to multiply in number, and although it wasn't immediately apparent, the guy realized that the number of monsters was increasing. It was complete madness in this dungeon. The guy was still conscious but badly wounded, and with great difficulty he asked Techera to come to him. He asked his friend Techera to take good care of his daughter. So the guy wrote in his diary that on the 25th of April, early in the morning, one of their comrades had passed away. That same day, but in the evening, Techera sat on a slope and watched the beautiful sunset. The boy asked the great Shiva to bless him and his friends, and asked that he be able to continue his diary entries tomorrow. There were now only 3 of them left, and Techera really hoped that their team would not shrink any further. Techera made another entry in his diary, writing that last night they had managed to destroy the 4th invasion of Luffs. The guy wrote that the 5th invasion had already begun today, and that, according to his count, there were at least 120 monsters. He wrote that they were fighting for their lives and that in the end, only 40 Luffs remained. Techera believed that he could handle that many monsters even on his own. The guy continued to write everything down in detail in his diary while his friends rested after the fierce battle. Techera really hoped that there would be no 6th invasion and that they would be able to leave tomorrow. However, his hopes were dashed, and during the 6th invasion, he lost the person dearest to him. The guy was in despair, but unfortunately, there was nothing he could do to fix it. Techera promised to capture the gate, but he saw no point in doing so without his girlfriend. The guy held his girlfriend in his arms and said goodbye to her, and at that moment, someone tried to attack him from behind. Techera only noticed the attack in the reflection of the glass and was able to dodge it, but he was still hit. Standing opposite the guy was his friend, which came as a huge surprise to him. Ram believed that Techera was definitely a rising star in India, but he was sure that it would not last long. Techera saw his friend's eyes and realized that the guy had somehow become a demon. The guy was angry because Ram had deceived them all, even though they all believed and trusted him, and the most hurtful thing for Techera was that Zaya trusted this man. Ram replied that he had never heard anything more stupid, and believed that the girl was simply not very intelligent and too naive. The guy admitted that he didn't know there were so many Luffs in this place, and thought that maybe he should have helped his friends. After all, because they were useless and died so quickly, he also found himself in danger. Techera was furious after hearing this and wanted nothing more than to get even with this demon. Ram said that Techera had managed to deal with the gate capture, and now the guy wanted him to give him the hurricane and go after his friends. The demon saw how angry Techera was, but he also saw that the boy was still afraid to die. Ram saw Techera running away from him as fast as he could, but it didn't matter to him anymore. The demon believed that Techera would soon die anyway because of the poison on his shoulder. Techera tried to hide because he felt that the 6th invasion of monsters was about to begin. The guy continued to be very angry, but he had another problem. He was losing feeling in his arm. Techera tried to hide in the maze and wanted to figure out what to do next. However, with every step he took, he felt worse and couldn't believe that it would all end like this. Techera could no longer feel his right arm and only now realized that the demon's sword must have been coated with poison. It no longer mattered to him whether it was poison or poison, because the guy felt that he was going to die anyway. However, he really wanted someone to find his diary. Techera wanted whoever found his diary to tell their families that they were sorry. Jun thought that this must be the last entry, but he found a few more pages. Techera wrote these entries with his last ounce of strength, saying that if his comrades had survived, they could have captured the gate. However, a demon prevented them from doing so, and the whole problem was their fault, which made the boy incredibly angry. Techera mentally turned to the great Shiva and asked his god to give him the opportunity to pass away in peace. The guy also asked the great Shiva to make sure all the bad guys got what they deserved, and that was the warrior's last wish. Thanks to these entries in Techera's diary, Jun was finally able to understand everything. He realized that the number of monsters depended on the number of players who entered. Jun came here alone, so there weren't that many creatures, which is why he was able to capture the gate relatively easily. Jun wondered what would have happened if he had come here with 3 other players, and the mere thought of it made him shiver so much that he didn't even want to think about it anymore. The guy took the diary after all, and now wondered what to do with the bow that had belonged to Techera. Jun decided to take the weapon for himself, but he didn't take the bow just like that. The guy promised that he would do whatever it took to make sure the demons paid for everything. Jun left the young hero of India and set off to fulfill his promise. Sometime later, Toku was holding the latest newspapers in his hands and admitted that his friend was right after all, because they hadn't had time to say anything, and the whole world already knew that it was Jun who had captured the gate. Jun couldn't understand why Toku was so surprised, because he had said from the very beginning that this was how it would be. Jun didn't understand why his friend had decided to come so early in the morning, since he could have sent everything via the internet. Toku replied that it was customary and more polite, and that the Indian government had sent the young man a message. The government was very grateful that Jun had been able to return Tikura's diary to them. Thanks to this diary, all the families were informed, no matter how difficult it was for them. Toku believed that Jun shouldn't hide his emotions, and the guy admitted that he was very happy that the families were able to learn the truth. However, the man still felt a little hurt, so he decided to leave all the newspapers with Jun. Toku spoke about the hurricane because it had been created as a national weapon intended for the defense of India, but now this weapon had disappeared from Tichara Vishi's inventory. Jun now understood what his friend was talking about and showed him the bow nicknamed Hurricane. Toku was speechless for the first few minutes, as he certainly did not expect this. However, the man could no longer control his emotions and shouted at the boy, asking him why he was holding this bow in his hands. Toku believed that Jun should have hidden this weapon well, as it belonged to the Indian government. The young man replied that he wanted to use it for a while and would definitely return it. The man grabbed his head because he was nervous that Jun would not understand that he would have to explain how he got the bow. Jun told his friend that he shouldn't worry so much about it, and promised that he would definitely think of something. Toku couldn't calm down and didn't understand how they could get out of this situation, since everyone had already decided that the hurricane had been lost. Jun was sure that with this weapon he would be able to attract the demon, and these words surprised Toku greatly, as he thought the demon had been destroyed at the gates. The boy began to suspect that this demon was not the only one hunting for the bow. Jun also believed that the demon had probably already read the articles about the hurricane being lost at the gates. However, despite this, the boy was sure that the demon was not so naive as to believe it. Jun had long since realized that for that creature, something was much more important than a human being. The guy was sure that the demon would then realize that the bow was in his hands and would definitely come after him. Toku completely agreed with his friend's opinion and remembered the demon. The man on the system window displayed an image of this demon whose name was Carl Signer, and this guy was known for his collection of bows. Jun now understood who everyone was talking about and thought that this guy had too much of an ego. Toku said that thanks to this demon, people were already searching for him all over the world. The man was sure that he could not have entered the Lufo garden on his own, as only those with level 10 could enter those gates. Jun was sure that this creature would start looking for him, and when he entered the unconquered gate next time, it would definitely try to capture him there. Moreover, the guy considered him stronger than even Tichara himself. Toku began to worry that his friend was in great danger and thought that he should tell the Indian government about everything. Jun, however, believed that if he focused on his training right now, there would be nothing to worry about. Besides, he didn't think the demon would be able to defeat him so easily. If Toku had been in his friend's place, he would probably have thought the same. However, the man was still very worried about Jun and couldn't do anything about it. Jun, on the other hand, was completely calm in this regard, as he was confident in his abilities and capabilities. The guy asked his friend not to worry too much and promised that the events of 25 years ago would never happen again. Toku calmed down a little and noticed that his friend hadn't changed a bit in all that time. The man suddenly received a call and hurried to answer it. Toku looked slightly upset by the phone call and couldn't quite believe what he had heard. Jun was curious to know what had happened, and the man replied that it was all because of journalists who had suddenly descended on them from all sides. The man explained that the journalists had found out that Jun was the player who had managed to capture the gate. The journalists were now eager to interview the young man. Jun asked Toku not to refuse them, because he couldn't avoid fighting the demons, so he hoped that he could at least choose the place of battle himself. The guy decided that they absolutely had to hold a press conference as soon as possible. After a while, the conference hall was full of people eagerly awaiting the appearance of the player who had captured the gate. Journalists received information that So Junho, a player from the association, had overcome the Curse of Dawn and then captured the Lufu Garden. They hadn't seen such newcomers in a long time and believed that this guy could be the next star of Korea. They believed that this guy also knew how to attract attention, because even among the many treasures, So Junho was the brightest gem. A few minutes later, Jun finally appeared on stage, looking simple and dressed in ordinary shorts and a t-shirt. People couldn't believe that the player who had scored 2 unstoppable goals was standing in front of them, and some began to think that the guy had come here by mistake. Jun couldn't help but notice how everyone was looking at him in surprise, and began to think that he should have changed into more presentable clothes after all. However, Jun still remembered that when he was a gloomy ghost, he had to dress up too often, and the guy had grown tired of it. Jun picked up the microphone, greeted everyone, and said that the press conference would last 30 minutes. The journalists asked the guy to tell them more about the capture of the gates, and they were also interested in knowing how Jun felt about taking such a step. They were also curious to know if the guy's debut was connected to any particular reason. Jun decided to start by telling the journalists a few words about the Gates of Dawn and how he had passed through them. Seeing how comfortable and confident the young man seemed, people began to think that this was not the first time for Jun. After a while, Jun said he was ready to answer the journalist's last question. They immediately asked him which gate he would enter next time. The guy replied that there was actually one gate he would very much like to enter, but because of his low level, he couldn't do it yet. Everyone was naturally curious about what gate he was referring to, and Jun admitted that he was talking about the East Sea Gate. This answer caused a storm of emotions among everyone in the hall. They immediately began asking the guy if he was referring to the same Eastern Sea Gate that So Jun-ho had mentioned. These were the last gates of Korea that had not yet been conquered, and if the guy managed to capture them, he would have completed the 3 most difficult missions. No one had ever achieved such a feat before. Jun did not argue and simply replied that these guys were absolutely right in their conclusions. One of the journalists said that there had been rumors for a long time that the strongest first-class monster lived in these gates, and she was very interested in what So Jun-ho thought about it. It was known that the association had long discussed giving these gates the first place in terms of difficulty, but that seemed too much. Therefore, it was not surprising that everyone had such a negative reaction, and judging by all appearances, the boss living in the gate was to blame. The boss's strength was noticeably different from that of ordinary monsters, and it was incredible. It was known that some of them even turned ordinary monsters into their servants and commanded them. Jun believed that if he fought a first-class monster, he would surely win. The latest news came out with a sensational story that Jun-ho would definitely win if they fought a first-class monster. The man reading the news saw that the journalists were making a big fuss about the newcomer. This, in turn, proved how important the unconquered gates were to people. This man admitted that he hadn't heard such amusing news from the first floor in a very long time. The man was asked to contact them if he was so interested, but he replied that he was not interested at all for the time being. He adhered to the theory that when something unusual happened, people called it a coincidence, but if it happened a second time, people called it a skill. The man believed that one should judge after the third time, because one could not even remember the names of those who could not make it to the third time. He believed that if the player So Jun-ho could perform such a miracle again, he would receive a personal invitation from the chief chairman Shin Sung-han to join the Tokebi Guild. After the conference, Jun was at home going through all the applications and trying to find something suitable for himself. Togu helped him with this, but no one could find anything worthwhile. Jun received a lot of requests in a short period of time, and his friend explained that it was all because of the conference, as the guy had become a real superstar. Togu checked the experience points awarded for each job, and paid attention to the level of difficulty, but he also made sure not to overlook the reward. The man realized that it was not easy to find a job that met all 3 conditions. Jun agreed to disregard the 3rd condition, but Toku believed that this should not be done, because the guy's future prospects depended on the first assignment. Toku thought he had finally found something suitable among the mountain of papers, and it was a task from a father whose daughter was seriously ill. The father needed a medicine for his daughter called the Heart of a Flaming Fox. Jun said that he hadn't heard anything about the Flaming Fox in a very long time. Toku reminded the young man that he had fought it only 6 months after becoming a player, and that Jun had almost died. Toku decided that the quickest way to find out was to take a look himself, as the gate was located in their country and was known to everyone as the Heavenly Fox Gate. They both decided to look at the system notification and saw that the level of these gates was high, and the most important condition for capturing them was to defeat the Fiery Fox. Toku saw that these gates had appeared only 3 months ago, and therefore had not yet been conquered, but the monster in these gates had already managed to devour 17. Jun thought that when he was a grim ghost, the conditions weren't as harsh, and on top of that, the monster seemed to have gotten much stronger. Toku decided to say that it wasn't as difficult as the guy had imagined, because now the level of the players had increased significantly. The man added that the characteristics of the items had also improved dramatically. Jun thought that since his return, he hadn't met any worthy players yet, so he couldn't say anything about it for now. They both agreed that they were ready to take on this task, and at the same time test the skills of the younger players. Toku was delighted and decided to confess to Jun that the assignment had actually come from an acquaintance of his. The person who wrote the assignment was the chairman of the Manhwa group, and since it was about his daughter, whose name was Choe Manhai, the chairman also had a second son, Choe Pilho. Suddenly, they heard a knock on the door, and a girl entered the room at the request of the president, and it was Ms. Cha Shi-eun. Suddenly, they heard a knock on the door, and a girl entered the room at the president's request. It was Ms. Cha Shi-eun. Toku introduced Shu to his friend and said that from now on, the girl would be his secretary and manager. Jun understood perfectly well why this was being done, because if the president himself continued to deal with his affairs, many people would definitely become suspicious. The girl greeted the young man personally and said that she was ready to start her duties at any moment. Toku believed that since they needed to organize a meeting with the Manhwa group, the guy should discuss all the details with Ms. Chashi-yun. The man considered this girl to be very capable, so June could rely on her without any problems. Already in the car, the girl decided to ask the guy if he was familiar with the Manhwa group, to which June replied that this group was #1 in Korea. The girl added that they were known for paying their taxes on time and protecting the privacy of the royal family. However, tragedy struck their perfect world. It was known that the daughter of Chairman Cho Pilho had been diagnosed with 9-yin syndrome. This was a rare disease that occurred in people with high yin energy. The only way to cure it was to transplant something with high yin energy into the body, and that object was the core of a flaming fox. The girl also said that 29 years ago, a gloomy ghost who was the best player was able to defeat the flaming fox. The guy thus confirmed his outstanding abilities. She decided to confess to the guy that she admired the gloomy ghost, and was surprised when Mr. Jun became embarrassed after hearing her words. Jun replied that he was simply very touched by her words about the gloomy ghost. After they arrived at their destination, Jun got out of the car and said that the place hadn't changed a bit. The girl was surprised that Mr. Jun had already been here, but the guy added that it had been a long time ago. Shai asked the guy to wait for her outside while she first checked if their agreement about the meeting was still valid. However, she didn't have to do that because they were already coming out to meet them in person. Chairman Choe came out to greet his guests and said that he was very pleased to meet Mr. Jun, as he had been looking forward to their meeting. Jun greeted the man and introduced himself to the chairman, adding that it was a great honor for him to meet him. Cho began by saying that standing before him was a hero who had captured the gate to ensure the safety of the citizen, and that it was therefore a great honor for him to meet the young man. The man took Jun by the hands and said that he had only one wish, which was for the young man to help cure his daughter of her serious illness. Jun suggested that they all go inside first and then clarify whether the chairman really needed the heart of a fiery fox. Chahwei confirmed this and said that he had already studied a considerable amount of information and learned about a case of 9-thread syndrome in France. It was known that the heart of a flaming fox was used for treatment. The man decided to get straight to the point and said that he was offering a reward of 1.5 billion won. Choi added that he would provide all the material assistance necessary to capture the mother, as well as everything else that might be needed to obtain the core. The girl was very surprised that the amount was so large and was sure that June would definitely accept the offer. However, the guy surprised everyone and replied that the conditions were not suitable for them. Chu thought that the reward was probably not enough for the guy and said he was willing to give 2.5 billion, but immediately changed his mind and said he would pay 3 billion won. June replied that he did not mean that the reward was small and that 1 billion won would be enough. In that case, Chue was very interested in knowing why the young man was refusing. June explained that in the past, a grim ghost had sold the core for 10 billion won to a billionaire from France. The guy also said that the billionaire had offered to give up his fortune to save his daughter, who was seriously ill, but the Grim Reaper refused and took only 10 billion won. June said that he had the same reason, and the man did not immediately understand what the guy meant. He decided to explain, and said that he believed it was wrong to profit from people who simply wanted to save their families. After a while, the girl told June not to wait for her because she still needed to park her car. June was still very curious about the story of the Grim Ghost. Did the president tell him about it, or who did? June replied that this was true, because President Shim-toku and the Gloomy Ghost had been very close friends in their time. The guy was also interested in knowing whether the girl believed this story, because people thought that the Gloomy Ghost was very cold, as if he had no soul. Shai replied that, on the contrary, if that guy had been heartless, he would never have done such a thing, and she was sure that the Grim Ghost was a very kind guy. The girl added that after the guy's words, she was even more convinced of this. She also said that she had heard that the Grim Ghost's parents had passed away before his eyes, and she believed that he had taken the 10 billion won for the heart only because the customer was rich. Otherwise, she was sure that the Gloomy Ghost would not have taken the money, because a person who tried so hard to save his family sincerely wanted no one else to suffer the same way. After some time, Togu asked June what he thought of Miss Shai. June replied that he had nothing to say yet, as they had only spent 2 hours together, but at first glance, the girl seemed nice to him. Toku believed that Ms. Shi was a very talented specialist and could easily find a job at a large company or a well-known guild. However, the girl only worked here because the Gloomy Ghost belonged to the association. June decided to change the subject and find out where his friend had taken him. Toku guessed that the guy didn't want to talk about it anymore because he was simply embarrassed. Toku believed that if Jun was going to fight such a powerful monster as the Flame Fox, he needed to do something first. The man believed that the young man needed proper equipment, so he took him to a special room. He explained that science had advanced greatly over the past 25 years. Toku said that during this time, weapons had been invented that Jun could not even imagine. He also said that the level of player safety had increased significantly during this time. Jun picked up one of the swords, and Toku asked his friend to try using his magic on the weapon. The guy was surprised by this request, but he didn't argue with his friend and did as he was asked. Toku told him that even when using a small amount of magic, it seemed to envelop the sword, recreating its shape, and that with its help, it was easy to destroy an orc. The man pointed to another sword and said that if the guy used magic on it, a magic shield would appear. Toku then pointed to another one and said that it was a magic bomb. Jun concluded that nowadays, players only used such weapons. Toku believed that there was nothing wrong with using modern, highly effective weapons. The guy decided to clarify whether the so-called ordinary players also used such weapons. Toku did not know the answer to this question, but he did know that those players had customized weapons. For Jun, it was like toys in the face of real monsters. The guy knew that those powerful monsters were capable of destroying even a player's magical circulation, so he was sure that these weapons were useless in battle. Jun decided to ask his friend if he knew why low-level players encountered weak monsters. Toku replied that it was probably because if strong monsters appeared, everyone would simply be sent to the afterlife. The guy said that was true, but that the system was quite fair in such cases. Jun believed that players should constantly develop by facing opponents of their own level, so that they would have a chance of surviving in the future. Toku realized that his friend apparently believed that this weapon was ineffective against strong monsters. The man admitted that players who relied solely on this weapon would never achieve anything worthwhile. However, Toku believed that one could not rule out the fact that it could be useful for capturing some gates. Jun replied that his friend might be right, but seeing a regular sword in the corner, he decided to demonstrate something. Toku confirmed that although this sword was made of new, high-quality material, it had no special abilities. Jun no longer spoke loudly but decided to demonstrate everything to his friend more clearly and use the sword for its intended purpose. Toku did not expect anything like this and was very surprised by what Jun showed him. Jun believed that the world had become so interesting, but that all these toys were blocking the player's unlimited potential for growth. A large crowd had gathered in a special area near the gate, as everyone was interested in this event. There were many reporters and players gathered at this place, and they were all in anticipation. Ms. Shi told Jun that there were so many people because everyone was very excited about the upcoming mission to capture the heart of the Flame Fox. The girl told the guy that 26 other players would be entering the gate with him, and some of them had been sent by the guild. Jun didn't seem very interested in this information, and was more fascinated by the lavender tea he liked. Jun casually said that after his return, he wanted to try this tea again. The guy also said that tomorrow they would need to get up early in order to prepare, and Ms. Shai didn't quite understand what he was talking about. The guy smiled and explained that they should prepare well because after the gate was captured, he would be inundated with orders. As soon as Jun got out of the car, reporters immediately began asking him questions. They were curious to know if he was really carrying out an assignment for a famous person from the Manhwa group. The guy was asked many other questions. Some players were not very happy about the appearance of the top player because all the attention was focused on him. They couldn't believe that this skinny guy had actually managed to capture the gate twice, and even his weapon looked too old-fashioned. A few minutes later, the interview was over, and one of the guys told all the players to quietly gather together. All the players were fully armed and ready to set off. They were all given the order to move out, and one by one, the guys set off to conquer the gate. It was recorded that at 11:28 in the afternoon, the players entered the burning dunes. The guys immediately discovered that they were surrounded by a continuous desert. One of the guys got everyone's attention and asked them to listen carefully. The guy introduced himself as Cha Minu and said he was a member of the Korean Guild of the 13th rank, Cheonhae. Most of the players were very surprised to learn that Cheonhae was participating in the raid. Min informed everyone that it was impossible to cope alone in such a place. The guy explained that at a gate of such complexity, they needed to avoid conflict so as not to endanger each other, and that was why he wanted to make an offer. Min informed everyone that the Cheonhae Guild was offering 10 million won to anyone who followed their instructions during the raid. In return, the Cheonhae Guild wanted to claim the main prize, which was the heart of the Flaming Fox. Many were outraged that the guild wanted to take the main prize for themselves and only offered them 10 million won. The guy said that the guild was sincerely trying to take care of them all, and that if anyone wanted to change their mind later, they would only be given 500,000 won. After these words, almost all the players started shouting and saying that they agreed to the proposed conditions. However, there was one person among them who was against these conditions and set off on his own. Min decided to ask Soo Junho if he wanted to join them, to which the guy replied that he planned to act independently. One of the guys couldn't help himself and said that he thought the rumors about this guy were exaggerated. He had heard that Jun was called their hope and genius, but if he decided to fight alone in a place like this, the outcome was obvious. The same guy told the commander not to worry about it, but Minu had no intention of doing so. The commander decided not to waste any more time and get ready. Juna knew that the flame fox was a creature that was something between a monster and a mythical creature. It was a boss monster that had grown 9 tails over more than 1,000 years. After all the tails had grown, it rose above the clouds and became a 1,000-year-old fox. It was known that the number of soldiers under the control of the flame fox was proportional to the number of tails it had. Juno was curious to know how many tails the flame fox at the gate had. The guy decided that he first needed to find a suitable place to hide. Suddenly, he discovered something that frightened him slightly, but he tried to remain calm. A bunch of foxes were rushing toward them, wanting to get even with their guests. Minu told everyone not to panic and wait for his command. The guy learned from the deputy commander that there were about 30 of these creatures. All the players were ready to face the danger head-on, because that was exactly why they had come here. A few minutes later, Minu gave the order to lay out the weapons specially prepared for such creatures. The players carried out the order in a matter of minutes, finding themselves in the center of it all. The foxes that reached the designated line felt the full force of these weapons. This happened to every monster that approached a certain perimeter. The guys were thrilled to see that their weapons worked perfectly. Minute looked at the monsters and said that they got what they deserved, because it was no longer the Stone Age with primitive weapons and traps. The guy wished that these creatures could see the power of the technology of the second floor of humanity. One of the guys reported to the commander that they had already destroyed more than half of them, and believed that if they continued in the same vein, capturing the fiery fox was only a matter of time. Min said that he really hoped that the guy was as good at killing monsters as he was at talking. Some players realized that they had been nervous about these gates for nothing, because there was nothing complicated about them. In their opinion, it was all because they had joined the Chonghae Guild. A few minutes later, they were all covered by someone's shadow, and it was something very, very big. Looking up, they saw a fox of enormous size towering majestically above them. This creature saw what all these people had done to its kin, and it enraged the monster greatly. The players encountered the boss of the Burning Dunes, and it was a fiery fox who wanted revenge on her offenders. The guys saw that this monster had 9 tails, and the horror was reflected on their faces. They realized that they were facing Kumiho. Everyone knew that the only fox that the Dark Ghost could defeat had 6 tails, and this creature had 9. Minu ordered everyone to pull themselves together immediately, focus, and stay in formation. The players prepared for battle, comforted by the fact that the Cheonhae Guild was with them, and that they would surely be victorious. Min thought about whether the monster would be killed by a blow to the heart or the head. The guy was sure that the trap he had prepared was several times more powerful than the ones they had used before, because if you fell into it, there was no way to escape. Min had no doubt that today he would be able to catch the flaming fox and thus surpass the grim ghost. The creature no longer stood idly by, but decided to release a large jet of fire. It was a powerful attack that not everyone managed to escape, and Minu was simply in despair. The boy only now realized that all their weapons, traps, and strategies were useless, as none of them had worked. Minu began to understand that defeating this creature was simply impossible and unrealistic. The firefox was very determined and had no intention of sparing any of them. Minu did not expect that he would soon be sent to the other world. However, a few minutes later, something happened that Minu did not expect. The guy was surprised when Jun suddenly appeared in front of him and blocked him with his body. Min couldn't understand what the guy was trying to achieve, but he thought that this player had no place here and that he should run away as quickly as possible. Jun simply replied that everything was fine and that the guy shouldn't worry about him. At that moment, the monster wasted no time and released another cloud of flames that was no less dangerous than the last. This cloud was so bright that it blinded everyone around, and the remaining guys were already mentally saying goodbye to their loved ones. However, Jun had other plans and a completely different mindset. Using his weapon, he stepped forward to confront the monster. Jun understood that the big mistake all these guys had made was that they had been too hasty. However, he wasn't sure that the firefox would be satisfied with just that. So he told Min to take the surviving guys and get out of there as quickly as possible. Min was not opposed to carrying out this task, but he also began to worry about So Jun-ho. Jun replied that he needed to deal with this creature. The firefox wasn't standing around doing nothing at that moment, but continued to spew fire. They tried to convince Minu to leave and do as So Jun-ho advised, but the guy still had doubts about the rightness of this decision. Eventually, Jun was left alone with the monster and was now ready to destroy it. After being left alone, the guy was ready to have some fun with the firefox. The creature became enraged after the guy's insolent and confident words. The monster began attacking Jun repeatedly, but the guy, though with difficulty, was still able to dodge. Jun fought the firefox using all his abilities. After a while, the guy realized that no matter how hard he tried, the fox wouldn't let him get close. The monster was on high ground and attacked the guy from there, not letting him get close. A moment later, the creature released a huge fireball that could have caused a lot of damage. Jun immediately recognized it as a giant fireball, and the guy was sure he wouldn't be able to withstand such a blow. After colliding with the ball, there was an incredibly powerful explosion. A large column of smoke rose from the explosion, and it was impossible to see anything through it. However, the monster was sure that it had destroyed the insolent man. Jun surprised the firefox by somehow managing to get right in front of the creature's face. The guy decided to take advantage of the opportunity and jumped straight onto the fox's snout. Jun didn't waste any time and decided to attack the firefox immediately. The boy realized that the strength of this fiery fox was directly proportional to the number of its tails. Jun now wanted to find out what would happen if he reduced the number of tails. The guy decided to get right to it and really hoped he'd be able to do it. Jun was almost certain that once the monster began to lose its tails, its strength would also diminish. On the other side of the gate, it was already late evening, but people were in no hurry to leave. Some even set up tents to make waiting more comfortable, as it had been 10 hours since the players entered the portal. One of them said that the previous team had only managed to hold out for 2 days, and these words angered his companion. He was angry because he felt that this was disrespectful to those who had died that time. All these people could do was hope for the safe return of all those guys. At that moment, on the other side of the fox, things were not going well, as Jun began to put his plan into action. The boy saw how difficult it was for the creature, and realized that this monster was probably experiencing something like this for the first time. Jun believed that this was all because the firefox had never had any worthy opponents, as all she did was hunt the local players. The firefox couldn't even imagine that this time she would become the prey. With every passing minute, it became more and more difficult for the monster, and it tried to figure out how to get out of this situation. Therefore, the firefox desperately began to attack the guy, hoping that this time she would succeed. Jun realized this at the last moment, and now tried to hide from the fireballs. The guy decided that if he just dodged, he wouldn't achieve anything. That's why Jun decided to attack in response. The creature decided to repeat the same trick with a giant fireball, but the guy was ready for it. Jun understood that the firefox was so angry because it felt that it would soon be sent to the other world. For the monster, everything was already decided, and in the guy's eyes, you could see only confidence in his actions. Jun gathered all his strength and directed his power at the firefox, and the monster was unable to dodge. The guy suddenly felt a strong weakness, which was apparently a backlash from using his power. Jun almost lost consciousness, but managed to receive a notification that he had managed to defeat the flaming fox after all. As a reward, the guy received the heart of the flaming fox. After a while, the reporters raised a commotion when they saw the players starting to come out, and were even more surprised that the guys had managed to capture the gate after all. Everyone remembered that the previous team had spent 2 days at the gate and ultimately failed, but these guys only needed 13 hours. Reporters began broadcasting live, saying that the players had started to come out of the gate, which had turned green. Everyone focused their attention on the player who was the first to come out of the gate. They spotted Cha Min-woo from the Cheonhee Guild carrying a guy on his back. Journalists immediately started shouting that they wanted to interview the guy, but Minu decided to hand the injured guy over to the medical staff first. The injured guy, who was laid on a stretcher, was So Jun-ho, and he looked in very bad shape. First aid was also given to Minu, and the guy was offered to go to the hospital immediately, but he replied that he wanted to do something first. Minwoo thought that he should say a few words to the reporters first. The reporters immediately started talking to him about how he was the team leader and had emerged victorious from the dungeon, and they all wanted Minu to share his feelings with them. Rumors had reached them that this time the fiery fox had 9 tails, and they wanted to know how difficult it had been for Jun. Minu had previously told them that he dreamed of becoming a hero, and now the journalists were interested in how the young man felt. Min only now felt what it was like to be praised. After all, once you've tasted fame, you don't want to give it up, even if it all happened by mistake. Min remembered how, long ago, his teacher had asked him to come to the front of the class and tell everyone about his plans for the future. The boy confidently began to talk about how, when he grew up, he would definitely become as outstanding a hero as the gloomy ghost. Min remembered all this and wished he could be that hero, but decided to do the right thing after all. The boy told everyone that this place did not belong to him, and decided to tell them everything that had happened inside the gates. After a while, Jun managed to open his eyes with difficulty and now tried to understand where he was. The guy saw an IV drip next to him and realized he was in a hospital, but he couldn't remember how he got there. Near his hospital bed, Jun saw Secretary Shi, who immediately asked how he was feeling. The girl told the guy that he was in a Korean hospital and that it was 6 in the morning. Jun replied that he was fine, but he still felt some discomfort in his head. While the guy was unconscious, The girl looked through the orders that had been sent and said that June was right after all, as there were actually a lot of orders. June no longer wanted to stay in the hospital and went to the house of Chairman Cho Pilho, as he was sure that they were already waiting for him there. The guy's actions greatly surprised his secretary. The girl tried to stop June, saying that he was still too weak. However, the guy believed that it was necessary to treat the real patient first, because he would always have time to rest later. The chairman was very grateful to the young man for coming so quickly. However, he was worried about June because he had heard from the Cheonhae Guild that the young man had lost consciousness at the gate. June smiled and replied to the chairman that he had simply fallen asleep due to exhaustion. The man led the boys to the door and said that his daughter's room was behind it. June entered the room and saw a girl lying motionless on the bed with an IV attached to her arm. The guy saw that the chairman's daughter was in even worse condition than he had thought. June decided not to waste any more time and to proceed with what he had come here to do. After the guy took out the core, it blinded the chairman so much that he couldn't see anything. June immediately apologized to the man, as he had completely forgotten that an ordinary person could be harmed by the heat of the core, so the guy suggested that the chairman wait outside. The man suddenly decided to ask the guy something because he was worried. He asked if it was safe to use such a dangerous object on his daughter, and added that he was just very concerned. June replied that, of course, not everyone was capable of performing this operation, but he had learned exactly how to do it from the grim ghost, so the father had nothing to worry about. The man shook the young man's hand and asked him to take care of his daughter, as she was very dear to him. June assured the chairman that it would only take a little time, and that everything would be over very soon. The young man didn't waste any more time and decided to get down to business, so he moved closer to the girl. June saw that the girl's condition was even worse than that of the patient he had treated earlier. So, to start with, he wanted to use the heat of his core to melt the frozen magical power. However, he somehow sensed a medium-level dark energy from the object and saw that he could absorb the dark power using his freezing skill. He then received a notification that his magic points would increase as he absorbed the dark power. It was known that the freezing skill had no drawbacks and was an all-powerful skill used for both attack and defense. Jun was surprised that this skill was also capable of increasing magic points when absorbing dark power. Even the Dark Guardian skill did not have such a function, and the boy knew that the freeze skill could absorb the dark power that emanated from the 9-yin breakdown syndrome. He was now curious to know if the Dark Guardian skill could also gain something from dark power. Jun decided that he would definitely have to check this out later. He decided to deal with it later, but for now, he was going to deal with the 9-yin breakdown syndrome. The guy understood that if he didn't hurry, the patient could get worse. Jun was going to get rid of the dark power that was sealed inside the girl's body. The guy was going to deal with all of this at once and really hoped that he would succeed. He remembered that the last time he was a dark ghost, he had to forcibly melt the frozen magical power using the warm energy of his core, thereby subjecting the patient's body to a high load. However, at that time, the guy had no other choice. But in this situation, everything was a little different. June was going to absorb only a certain amount of dark power from the girl's body, and was going to do so in order to restore the balance. The guy thought this method was much safer. The chairman sat outside the door the whole time, unable to calm down because he was very worried about his daughter. After a while, June finally came out, and it was immediately clear how much he had spent in that room. With a smile on his face, the guy told the man that his daughter's treatment had been successfully completed. He added that the girl was completely healthy, and there were no complications. After hearing these words, the man could not hold back his tears, and they were tears of happiness. The chairman fell to his knees in front of the young man, all because he was so grateful to him for saving the person most dear to him. Already in the car, the girl thought that as soon as they returned to the association, the young man would need to rest properly. The secretary thought that June would still need to refrain from physical exercise for some time. June decided to tell the girl that the mission had been successful only thanks to her. Later, the chairman admitted that he had been thinking for a long time about how to repay the young man, and at first wanted to increase the reward, but he was sure that Juno was not interested in that. The young man replied that he had simply done what he had to do. That is why the man decided to choose a slightly different way to thank the person who saved his life. The chairman said that whenever So Jun-ho needed help, Manhwa Group would do everything possible to assist him. Manhwa Group was the #1 company in South Korea, and was currently operating in every industry. The real weapon of this company was the chairman's eldest son, Cho Pilho, a master of the Red Tower Guild. It ranked 5th in the Korean guild rankings, and if the players of this guild were called upon at the right moment, they would provide invaluable assistance. June replied to the chairman that he would use this information with extreme caution so as not to damage the reputation of the Manhwa Group. The man said that the young man should let him know if he ever needed anything. Toku told his friend that he had just spoken on the phone with Cho Pilho, who was very happy that his daughter had finally recovered. The man was still worried about how Jun was feeling, but he assured him that he was fine, just a little sore. Toku didn't understand how that was possible after what he had been through, and thought that maybe he was taking some kind of medication. Jun replied that he wasn't taking any medication, of course, but that his energy levels had risen significantly this time, and his abilities had greatly improved. That was probably why he felt so much better. The guy decided that now he could finally get to the point and show his friend something. Jun showed him the very core, and Toku was simply speechless at what he saw. Toku couldn't believe his eyes. He couldn't believe he was seeing the very core of the flame fox. Jun decided to explain and said that his friend could see it, because he hadn't used it to heal the chairman's daughter. The guy explained that instead, he had absorbed the dark power with his freezing skill. Toku did not expect his friend to be capable of such a thing. Jun replied that the system had informed him of this news and shared that his magic points had even increased. Jun also said that thanks to the system, he had learned something very useful. It turned out that the freezing skill could absorb dark power from any object. This skill, as it turned out, could absorb dark power not only from a disease similar to the 9-yin breakdown syndrome, but also from any object. Toku guessed that Jun probably wanted him to find a suitable object. However, the young man was concerned about the fact that the 9-yin breakdown syndrome was described as having medium-level dark power. Toku did not expect that a disease that modern medicine could not cure was only of medium level. The man believed that in that case, there was no point in absorbing dark energy from ordinary objects. The man decided that he would take on the search while Jun should start studying the market. The young man thought that it had been a long time since he had dealt with the player market. It was widely known that the offline market was active not only in Korea but all over the world. In that market, you could find an incredible number of items found in the gates. It also gained popularity among ordinary people, so it was usually impossible to push your way through that market. Jun walked through the market after some time and couldn't remember when he had last been to Insadong. The guy noticed that this place had become much livelier. After the gate appeared, people focused solely on their survival. Jun was very happy that everything had finally worked out, which meant that a lot of work had not been done in vain. However, at that moment, the guy was interested in a completely different goal, and that was the black market. Jun entered the movie theater and looked for his seat according to the ticket he had purchased. He knew very well that there was a special place in the cinema that was intended for players. It was a kind of teleportation zone that could be used to get to the black market. Jun was a little dissatisfied with the fact that the teleport was not working well. He was surprised that many items from the gate had given this world unlimited possibilities, but the teleport was still causing motion sickness. The silhouette of a girl that appeared before him suggested that the gloomy ghost use her own magic. Jun wanted one thing. It was trivial, but the guy wanted to see them as soon as possible. In an instant, he found himself in a completely different place, the underground city of Ethiopia. It was easy to see that the atmosphere in this black market was radically different. However, only select customers could enter this place. Similarly, each player market was just a port leading to this place. The guy was intrigued by the conversation of a couple standing a little apart, as they were talking about him. The couple said that they hadn't seen Kim from the 9th heaven at Jun's place lately, and they were very curious how long the association was going to hide the gloomy ghost. There were no guides or ordinary people who came just to shop in this black market. The usual laws of society did not apply in this underground world. The guy slowed down a little because someone apparently recognized him as the guy who had captured the gate, and then he realized that this place was definitely not the safest. However, the chance of meeting a player who would pose a real threat to him was quite low. This was because most of the strong players had long since moved up, so to speak. The guy understood that those who had stayed in this place either lacked the skills to get to the second floor or had decided to go back down, unable to withstand the pressure. Jun understood perfectly well that such players were no match for him, and he could behave more relaxed and confident. Without saying much, he told the guys who were in his way to move immediately. However, to his surprise, they obeyed and left right away. He approached a special window where a relaxed man was sitting on the other side. This man immediately recognized the young man as the most famous player in Korea. Jun, however, did not react to these words, and said that he had come to see the artifacts. These artifacts gave the player certain qualities or distinctive skills. The man immediately pointed to one of the shelves and added that everything he had was on that shelf. Jun had actually thought of different possibilities for some of the artifacts, but he didn't expect much. Near some of the artifacts, Jun felt a low level of coldness coming from the objects, as well as a dark force and icy energy. The guy hoped that even if the objects were of a low level, he would still be able to increase his magic points. By the way, Jun told the man that he had heard that there was a separate room in his shop with the best artifacts, which were sold to newbies without their names. The merchant was very surprised at first, but then shouted that no one could have told him about it, and stopped himself mid-sentence. realizing that he had said too much. Jun noticed that the man was not very good at lying. Jun asked permission to just take a look and promised that he would definitely buy several items from the main hall and added that he would not tell anyone. The man realized that he had no choice, so he led the young man into a special room. He opened the door and allowed the young man to enter and look around, saying that this room contained the finest artifacts. These artifacts were in perfect condition, but there was no sign of any dark power anywhere. In principle, this was not surprising, as such items were not often found. Jun had already discovered something interesting, and that was the property of ice. The merchant tried to stop the guy by shouting that he wasn't to touch anything. The guy paid no attention to the merchant and stared at the artifact, which possessed incredible power capable of freezing. It was a glove that accumulated the anger of an ice fairy, and its level was very rare, and it was cursed. The anger of the ice fairy gradually froze the body of whoever used the glove, and only those with a 10th level could use it. Putting on the glove, the guy felt medium-level icy energy from the object and received a notification that he could cleanse the item of the curse by absorbing it. Jun noticed that it was the same medium level as the 9-yin breakdown syndrome. He remembered the chairman's daughter and rejoiced, realizing that he could gain the same amount of magic. In the end, the guy said he would buy this artifact and the ones he had already chosen earlier. After that, the guy decided to go to one establishment and had no idea what events awaited him there. As soon as Jun entered the room, all eyes were on him. He approached the counter and said he wanted to order a teleport to Insadong in Korea. The guy was told that his request had been accepted and that the waiting time for the teleport would be about 10 minutes. While Jun was ordering his teleport, some guys were watching him closely. They recognized him as the famous player, So Jun-ho. One of the guys said that he had heard a lot about the guy, and that everyone considered him a promising newcomer. Jun thought that the black market was definitely not a place to hang out, and that he'd better not linger here. It was very important for players to gain universal recognition, as it determined whether they could join a guild and how many assignments they would receive. However, after achieving impressive success, it became increasingly difficult to jump higher than one's own head each time. Therefore, some players use this method to assert themselves. One of the guys decided to attract attention to himself by breaking Jun's glass, telling him to look at him and calling himself Sanbei. Jun continued to ignore the guys, and they became angry and decided that they simply had to teach this insolent boy some manners. They believed that he should be grateful to them for cleaning the streets of gangsters while he was quietly developing his abilities. One of them pointed to himself proudly and said that he had 5 years of excellent experience. Jun could no longer listen to this calmly and grabbed his stomach with laughter. The guy was amused by the words about cleaning the streets, and unable to hold back any longer, Jun said that it was actually the first generation of players who deserved the credit, not these incomprehensible creatures. Jun added that all they did was intimidate weak newbies and try to get themselves into the pages of a cheap newspaper. The guys were losing patience and could no longer control their anger, believing that they had to teach the insolent boy a lesson. Jun saw all the anger in these guys and understood where this was going to lead in the next few minutes, so he decided to get a head start and told them to attack him. He said that he would soon be able to experience true pleasure after dragging them all through the mud. 2 reporters happened to be at the establishment, watching everything closely, thinking that if So Jun-ho was punished, it would make for a great article. One of the men believed that these guys just wanted to become famous by defeating a newcomer and considered them pathetic. The guys believed that they could say whatever they wanted because they didn't care, and all that mattered to them was the outcome of the fight. They were sure that So Jun-ho, who had defeated the Fiery Fox, would soon be defeated by the Gangnam Trio. Jun first decided to check how long it would take for his teleportation device to be ready, and immediately heard that they needed about 4 more minutes. The guy thought for a moment and decided that 4 minutes would be enough for him to have some fun. Sanbei was determined and had no doubt that with his weapon, he would defeat the guy in a matter of minutes. He said that he was a dangerous spearman from the Gangnam Trio, and that Jun should be proud to have the honor of fighting it. Jun held his weapon at the ready, which was a small dagger, and this confused Sanbei. After all, the guy had heard earlier that Jun used a sword in battle. The guy replied that he didn't need to use a sword to fight them. These words greatly angered Sanbei, and he could no longer hold back, so he rushed into the attack. Jun easily dodged the attack, and not a single muscle on his face moved, as he was completely calm. He just as easily grabbed his opponent's weapon and immediately attacked back. It was done really professionally and effectively, and in the end, Sanbei lost consciousness. Everyone who witnessed the fight was very surprised, as no one expected such agility and dexterity from Jun. Some guys thought that Sanba was to blame for everything because he fell for the provocation. Another guy immediately stepped forward, ready to replace Sanba and teach Juna a lesson. The guy who decided to stand up to Jun immediately used his magic and aimed it at the guy. It was done quickly, but Jun managed to dodge it. Jun ordered another guy from the powerful trio to attack. A real battle began, and all the guys were sure that they would easily defeat their opponent. They didn't take Juna seriously, and believed that he had simply been lucky to defeat a few monsters and nothing more. They were also certain that Juna had never had to kill anyone before. They were confident that such people were too sure of their victory, and therefore, the moment they lost their vigilance, they could easily be destroyed. One of the guys believed that this was the big difference between them, and that the advantage was clearly on their side. June surprised them again by easily neutralizing another guy. There was one guy left, and June still wanted to meet the deadline he had set for himself and teach these insolent people a real lesson. The guy was a little confused at first, as he was absolutely sure that June was incapable of anything, but the circumstances spoke for themselves. He was furious that a mere player had been able to destroy the Kanem trio in just a few minutes. June had no intention of sparing anyone, so he rushed to attack the remaining guy. The guy suddenly remembered the moments when he was still a gloomy ghost. He thought about how he had previously managed to defeat countless demons. June remembered that it was all thanks to a skill that allowed him to read his opponent's breathing. June decided to demonstrate what he was capable of, and it was a mesmerizing sight. After that, it was impossible not to notice the surprise on the remaining guy's face. June approached him as closely as possible and told the guy that his breathing was too predictable. In the end, Jun dealt with this man in a matter of minutes and hoped very much that he would never have to see his face again. Sonbi still couldn't move or stand up, but he promised Jun that he would never even dare to look at his shadow again. The people who had become involuntary spectators of this battle spoke admiringly about how the guy had managed to defeat 3 players with 5 years of experience and considered Juno simply magnificent. Juno realized that the world had become too strange for him, as if everyone had turned into players inside a game. The guy believed that for their own benefit, these people would even send a person to their death. He was simply more concerned about the winner than the victim. Juno knew only 3 ways to survive in this crazy world. While the guy was lost in his thoughts, he was informed that his teleport was ready. He entered the teleport and returned to his thoughts about how to survive in this world. June believed that the first way was to stop thinking rationally like everyone else. The second was to turn off his emotions, and the third was to live in constant agony. A moment later, the teleport lit up in a completely different place. June stepped out of the teleportation device and continued on his way, feeling a little sad because he missed his friends very much. The car showed a video of June's last battle and said that the video had been filmed on the black market a few minutes ago. The man added that the guy had managed to defeat 3 players with his excellent skills. The man said that this player had exceeded all his expectations, but he was more interested in what the princess herself thought about it, who was sitting in the back seat of the car at that moment, eating her ice cream with gusto. The girl was thinking about everything she had just been told and shown, looking very relaxed. After a few long minutes of silence, she decided to ask what the player's name was. Juno was asked to smile for a better photo. However, the guy couldn't understand what he was doing there, because he hadn't signed up for this. The girl who was taking pictures with the star at that moment made a remark, reminding him that he was not alone. Only after these words did Juno notice that a whole line of people had formed around him. He began to realize that at this rate, he would probably not get home until nightfall. A girl who had called him and was standing next to a man who appeared to be her bodyguard pulled June out of his thoughts. The girl asked June to spare her a few minutes of his precious time. Juno looked more closely at the girl who had asked for his attention, and seeing her fiery hair and the heat emanating from her body, he understood something. There could only be one person standing before him, and that was a member of one of the most powerful guilds in the Big Six. It was Princess Konju-ha of the Tokabi Guild. June handed the guy her business card, and emphasized that she was in good health and of sound mind. The guy was pleasantly surprised that Tokabi herself had come to him and, judging by everything, wanted to hire him. The girl suggested that June discuss the job offer at a nearby coffee shop if he was interested. June was not opposed to the idea, and besides, he really wanted to get away from all the people waiting in line for him. Once they were in the nearby coffee shop, the girl complained about the unbearable heat outside. She also said that she didn't like going outside at all because it was so hot, and now it was impossible to go without a mask and glasses. June actually thought that the princess specialized in fire skills. The girl replied that this was precisely the problem, as she actually preferred the coolness. While the guard brought the girl a cool chocolate cocktail, June thought about how even the demons seemed to be afraid of this princess, even though she looked like an ordinary girl. The same man offered the boy a refreshing drink, which slightly surprised him. June couldn't understand what the Tokebi Guild really wanted from him. The princess invited the young man to join them and told him that the deputy head had ordered her to hire a player named So Jun-ho. She added that she didn't want to waste any time. Ju wanted to evaluate the guy in person, and she told him that he had passed her personal test. The guy wanted to know what criteria he had used to pass the training. Ju replied that she had initially noticed the player's achievements and was very impressed by them. The princess rated June as a super rookie, which puzzled the guy a little. He himself understood that at that moment, There was no one who could surpass him in experience. The girl said that she also highly valued Jun's martial arts skills and potential. Jun realized that this was probably because of what had happened to him on the black market. The girl did not hide her feelings and replied that he had proven to be very good in battle. The princess really wanted to check if the guy's main skill was really just wielding a D-level weapon, and he said that was true, and that it was listed on his official profile. The princess couldn't stop being amazed, and the guy intrigued her more and more. She tried to convince Jun by saying that he had already managed to build a career with just one D-level skill, and she couldn't even imagine what would happen if he added others. The princess told him that if he joined their guild, he would have access to books on various skills. In addition, their coordinators would create a special route through the main gates so that he could develop faster. Juna was impressed, because not only did they have huge resources, but their incentive and payment system was much better than that of the association. Now he understood why strong players didn't stay in the association. The girl had no doubt that Juna was well aware that their guild was one of the best in the world. In addition, they knew more about the second floor than the association. The princess had no doubt that it would be much better for the guy to join them than to stay in the association. She believed she had presented very compelling arguments and was now waiting for the young man's decision. The princess simply saw no reason for refusal, since it was the powerful Tokabi guild that was involved, and the commander himself had come to see the young man in person. John didn't think long, and immediately replied that he had to decline their offer. The girl didn't immediately understand what the player was saying, as she couldn't even imagine that he would refuse. It took the princess a little time to comprehend the refusal, and she simply could not contain her emotions, as she was in a state of bewilderment. Jun understood perfectly well that by joining the guild, he would be able to earn money and fame very quickly, but he knew that nothing comes for free. If he joined them, he would have to obey all the guild's orders. Perhaps at the moment this could be beneficial to him, but later, the same guild could become a shackle for him. The princess looked a little confused and thought that perhaps she had not explained something clearly to him. Jun replied that he understood perfectly well that it was an excellent offer, but he did not want to accept it. The princess was convinced that the guy sitting in front of her was not as simple as he seemed at first. She understood that even if Jun joined the guild, he would have to work very hard to achieve a high position. Competition in the guild was quite fierce, as the elite competed with the elite. The princess decided to ask the guy if he had really decided to turn down their offer, and Jun simply apologized. She realized that she would not be able to change his mind. Finally, the girl decided to give the guy some advice and told him that he should be very careful in the future. Jun was tired of the conversation and decided to ask her if they were going to take revenge on him in any way. The girl replied that they weren't going to do anything stupid like that, and added that demons had been too active lately. The princess also told him that, strangely enough, the same thing had happened on the first floor. Jun realized that, in other words, they were definitely up to something. The girl replied that anything was possible, but the association did not yet have this information. The girl said that if he suddenly encountered the demons without prior preparation, she would feel sorry for him. The guy, being a well-mannered person, simply thanked the princess for her advice. The girl decided that their conversation was over and waved goodbye. Jun, already at home, told his friend that the demons hunting the princess had become more active. He believed that this was most likely the case, as he saw no reason for Tokabi to lie. Toku, of course, knew that the guilds had more information, but he didn't think it was that much. The man was also curious if Jun regretted turning down Tokabi's offer, since the princess had come to him personally, which meant a lot. The guy replied that he didn't really, because if he had been after fame and money, he definitely wouldn't have turned her down. However, Jun didn't really care about those things. Jun noticed how his friend's expression changed slightly after his words, and suggested that perhaps he wanted him to leave. Toku didn't regret it. He just thought that the guild might be able to help the guy. Jun was sure that if he agreed, the guild would become a problem for him. He felt much freer in the association, and therefore believed that Toku had nothing to worry about. The man couldn't contain his joy and emotion, so he decided that on this positive note, they should do something. Toku offered Jun a new contract and added that he would give the guy an entire floor. The guy was surprised that he wanted to do this right now, and wasn't sure if it was even possible. The man replied that he could because he had turned down an offer from one of the members of the Big Six. Toku added that they were currently in good financial shape and that he would do everything possible to bridge the gap. Jun was happy to hear this and thanked his friend for everything he had done for him lately. The young man was about to leave, but then remembered to ask which floor he would be moving to. Toku replied that he could move to the 77th floor. Jun asked the man to add to the schedule that the capture of the EC gate would take place in a week. Toku couldn't understand why it would take so long at first, but then he thought that it was probably because Jun wanted to give the demons time. The guy confirmed this theory and said that all he had to do was bait them and wait. All the news reported that player So Jun-ho had announced his intention to conquer the East Sea Gate. This was an unprecedented event for everyone, because if the gate was captured, Korea would become the first safe zone in the world. It was also reported that the association had renewed its contract with player So Jun-ho, thereby strengthening their partnership. It was also discussed that Jun had rejected the offer from the Tokebi Guild and decided to remain with the association after all. The whole world watched with bated breath as this player's next move unfolded. One guy was watching this news closely from inside a dark cave. Afterwards, he went outside, carefully thinking over everything he had just heard, surrounded only by mountains. This guy summoned a creature because he wanted to discuss important matters with it. He showed him an article about a player named Jun, which said that the guy intended to capture the gates of the Eastern Sea. The guy assumed that the hurricane was now right where the player from the news was. The creature only knew that the bow had disappeared from Teacher Avishi's inventory. The mysterious guy replied that it was obvious to him, as he had no doubt that Jun had simply hidden it from the public eye. He knew that Jun had made public the information that the demon had sent India's rising star to the afterlife, so it was only natural that the player would now always be on guard. The creature decided that in that case, he should go down to the first floor, but the guy thought it wasn't worth it, since they had no proof. Besides, they couldn't afford to run into the association, especially in the current situation. The guy wanted to know if there was anyone else on the first floor they could use. He was told that there were Shadow Brothers left on that floor whom they wanted to use soon at an auction in Las Vegas. The guys stood out even among those who craved power. The guy decided that in that case, he would enter the gates of the Eastern Sea together with that player, and it didn't matter to him whether So Jun-ho went to the other world or survived. Suddenly, at that very moment, the mysterious guy sensed something, and his eyes lit up red. The guy cursed and became very angry, knowing from the feeling that it was a sword of anger. He immediately ordered his companion to prepare to move. The guy was angry because Kim's sword of anger was in Jun's hands. However, what angered him even more was that even he, a skilled marksman, was powerless to resist it. He understood that because of him, he couldn't go down to the first floor and get the hurricane himself. The guy was even more angry because he thought they were just mocking him. The guy's name was Carl Signer, and he was going to personally follow Jun, confident that the guy's luck would run out soon. At that time, Jun was doing physical exercises and hoping that the person they needed would take the bait. The guy started talking about players from America who were Shadow Brothers. He was curious to know if these guys were really going to participate in the capture of the Eastern Sea Gate, and if so, it was all too suspicious for Jun. Jun had already asked his secretary Shai to find out everything about these guys, and do it as soon as possible. At that moment, Jun decided that it would be useful for him to learn how to use magic while in a state of energy depletion. The guy knew it was a little dangerous, but Sky showed him a method that would allow him to achieve the best results. In a moment he could feel this energy and it felt like a warm welcome. Jun decided that he wasn't going to be cautious about using his Dark Guardian skill at the gates of the Eastern Sea. The East Sea Gate was located on the island of the Forgotten Dragon, and based on the name, there was a high probability that the first-class monsters would resemble dragons. Dragons were one of the strongest species among first-class monsters. Jun learned the condition for capturing these gates, and it was to eliminate the nameless dragon. He understood perfectly well that newbies would not be able to leave even a scratch on such a powerful beast. He remembered how he had tried to defeat them in the past, but since he had no flying skills, it would most likely still be difficult for him to deal with them. The guy knew that he would have to either grab the dragon's scales and fight it directly, or bring the beast down to the ground. He could only see these two options, but he didn't know which one to choose yet. Jun received a notification from his secretary stating that all the materials requested by the Shadow Brothers had just been sent to him. The guy simply did not expect it to happen so quickly. It was about the Shadow Brothers, Vincent and Edward, a group of 2 players operating in the United States. They were veteran brothers who had successfully completed over 200 missions and were trusted with the protection of VIPs. It was a special case where both brothers were able to develop their shadow skills. In their homeland, when they were interviewed and asked about the reason for their participation in the capture of the East Sea Gate, the brothers gave an answer that was remembered by many. The reason for their participation, as they answered, was that they were imbued with the boundless determination of So Jun-ho. The brothers were asked if they were confident of victory, to which they both replied that they were simply expressing their respect for the player Jun. According to them, Jun was a player who was able to complete missions in the most inaccessible places. The brothers were very excited to be able to help such a person capture the last unconquered gate of Korea. Jun watched their interview in its entirety and decided that he had to take advantage of this opportunity. Soon, events were unfolding on Ilsan Beach, where access was strictly prohibited to ordinary people, as it was the area where the gates appeared. The day everyone had been waiting for finally arrived, the day of the capture of the East Sea Gate. Not only Korean reporters gathered at the site, but also foreign ones. The attention of the whole world was focused on the capture of these gates. Toku wanted to know how his friend was doing, and the guy told him he was incredibly excited. The man did not expect to hear this, and all his emotions were written on his face. Jun pointed to his phone and said that these low-quality games would make anyone nervous. Toku was angry because he had been asking the guy to throw away this relic and not use it for a long time. Toku also noticed that the guy looked a little too carefree, and decided to remind Jun that these gates had already destroyed more than 500 people. Jun replied that he had actually defeated the Ice Queen herself, and didn't think it was necessary to worry about some unknown dragon that didn't even have a proper name. Toku thought that maybe that made sense. Toku told him that Jun would not be alone today, but would be accompanied by his shadow brothers. Jun thought that since there were only 3 of them participating in the capture, there was a high probability that they were collaborating with demons, and judging by their profile, the brothers seemed quite strong. The guy was worried that these brothers might attack him from behind. Toku said that unfortunately they had no proof, but the man had a bad feeling and would not mind canceling the gate capture. Jun asked his friend not to worry so much and added that even if the brothers decided to pull some kind of trick, he had a plan. The brothers greeted Jun and added that they were both big fans of his. They were surprised how such a skinny guy managed to capture 2 gatekeepers and considered it simply incredible. Jun replied to the guys in their native language that he hadn't done anything special. The brothers were surprised again because they couldn't even imagine that Jun spoke English. One of the brothers thought that in that case they didn't need to worry about the language barrier, as he had thought that the operation to capture the gates might be in jeopardy given Vito's translation skills. Now they were sure that there would be no problems. The brothers knew that these were the last uncaptured gates of Korea, and they understood perfectly well how important this was for everyone. Therefore, they promised to do everything in their power. Jun told his brothers that they shouldn't worry too much, as he had managed to prepare well. Reporters on the news said that players from both countries were currently exchanging friendly greetings. If they succeeded, Korea would ultimately become the safest zone in the world. For almost everyone, the most exciting moment of the gate capture was entering the gate itself. This was because the conditions and monsters waiting inside were still unknown. That is why the players' emotions reached their peak when they entered the gate. However, the risk associated with all of this could not be ignored. The players were so focused on the upcoming battle that they did not expect an attack from behind, and therefore could not react properly. The brothers believed that this was the moment they needed to use to achieve their goal. However, one of the brothers began to doubt that now was the right moment to strike Jun from behind. One of them began to get angry that they had missed such a great opportunity and did not notice what his brother was so wary of. Ahead, after the fog cleared a little, they discovered a real island. The guy was angry that their mission to launch an instant attack had failed, and now they would have to wait for the right moment during the battle itself. They all felt how fresh it was in this place, and couldn't even imagine what kind of landscape they would see at the gates. The brothers were all looking for the so-called unknown dragon, but they didn't see a single monster. They called Jun to see if he could see anything suspicious nearby. Jun began to suspect that something was wrong with this place, and that the local boss didn't even have a proper name. However, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that this was a first-class gate. A few minutes later, someone's shadow suddenly appeared above them. The brothers no longer looked so cheerful and didn't understand what had appeared right above their heads. When they looked up, they saw a huge dragon of impressive size. The brothers began to guess that the one everyone called the Nameless Dragon was above them. The boys now knew the location of this monster, but they didn't know how to destroy it, so they were sure that the player Jun would help them with this question. The brothers looked around, but Jun was nowhere to be seen, and they certainly hadn't expected such a turn of events. The boys began to understand what had just happened and what trouble awaited them. The boys could hardly believe it, because they hadn't even noticed when Jun had left. The brothers ended up face to face with the Forgotten Dragon, who looked terrifying. The monster wanted to deal with its uninvited guests as quickly as possible and began attacking the boys. Jun had been hiding in the trees the whole time, and now wanted to see if the brothers had been working with the demons or not. One of the brothers, assessing their situation, decided not to waste any more time and summoned the Shadow Soldier. He told his brother Vincent to find Jun as quickly as possible while he distracted the dragon. Vincent wasn't sure his brother could handle the task alone. However, Edward decided to remind his brother who he was, and told him to just bring Jun to him as soon as possible. While Vincent ran off to look for Jun, who had disappeared, his brother began to attack the dragon with all his might. Edward was very determined and hoped that his brother would arrive in time. Vincent ran through the forest as fast as he could, thinking about how long it had been since he and his brother had been in a situation like this. The guy thought that if everything suddenly turned out to be as much of a failure as it had been during the auction in Las Vegas, they would be doomed. Suddenly, he saw a shadow in the distance and immediately headed in that direction, thinking that Jun wasn't such a smart guy after all. He thought that Jun was so stupid that he couldn't even hide his magical aura, thus revealing his location. Vincent started calling Jun and shouted at the guy to finally come out to him, adding that his brother was currently fighting alone and they desperately needed his help. The guy even threatened Jun not to even think about causing trouble and to come out. Vincent no longer stood and waited, so he rushed to the spot with his weapon, but his surprise knew no bounds. The guy never found June and saw a dark place ahead that was heavily overgrown with trees, and it looked like his shadow territory ability. However, Vincent still couldn't understand why he had such a bad feeling. The guy didn't understand what was going on because he had just felt Juna's magical aura so clearly. However, now Vincent no longer felt anything and could not understand the reason for these changes. Jun now saw and understood that the brothers were indeed demons, and he even felt a little sorry for them. He said all this confidently, standing behind Vincent. Vincent was surprised and didn't understand how the guy was able to do all this, and he was slightly puzzled. He pretended that he did not understand what Jun was talking about or what he meant. Jun knew that the guy understood any language, and he was sure that the brothers were demons, so he saw no point in continuing this charade. Vincent decided that the guy was just mad at him for attacking him, and that's why he was accusing him so loudly. The guy thought his actions were totally justified since Jun had betrayed them first. Jun appreciated how convincingly Vincent could deceive, but he no longer saw any point in it. He said that to be convincing, the guy should at least have disguised his bright red pupil. After all, that was the most distinctive feature of demons, their crimson eyes. Vincent now understood what Jun was talking about and became angry that he had lost control of himself and hadn't even noticed. Of course, this was not surprising, since no one had ever suspected anything before. Jun saw how the guy was struggling and couldn't control his crimson eyes. After these words, Vincent pulled himself together and told Jun that he seemed to have completely lost his fear and would soon regret it. The American player said that he didn't even think about trembling, because their truth had been revealed, because he was completely confident in his abilities. Vincent was a very rare demon who appeared at the gates, and it was known that if you destroyed a demon and drank its energy, you could then become a demon yourself. After that, all emotions are dulled and your temper becomes harsher. However, in return, one gains the skill of devilish energy, and the moment a person is filled with devilish energy, a piercing feeling arises that cannot be compared to anything else. Vincent decided that it was time to get rid of this guy and not waste his precious time. That is why, at that very moment, he used his skill and directed his devilish energy at Jun. Jun turned out to be not as easy as Vincent thought, and at that moment he lost sight of Jun again. Jun also didn't waste any time and used the night step, doing it very beautifully and effectively. In response, Vincent heard that Jun had initially only been able to superficially hide his signs of presence. Jun said that after getting used to the skill a little, he would definitely learn other things as well. He could sense different sounds and sensations very well, as if they weren't his own. Vincent saw and heard all this and now couldn't even imagine what to expect at the next level. Edward realized that there was nothing he could do because the nameless dragon would not descend below the clouds. The boy was distracted by the voice of his brother, who was rushing toward him and looked very excited. Edward didn't understand why his brother had come alone, so he asked where the player Jun had gone. Vincent, out of breath, began to tell him that the player Jun was very strange, and that he had exposed them, and now knew that they were demons. He also said that even though he had used his devilish energy, he had not been able to sense him. Edward didn't understand how his brother had managed to escape, since the player Jun was so capable, but for some reason he had let Vincent get away. Vincent tried to prove to Edward that he was not mistaken, and that his feelings were not wrong. However, his brother believed that Vincent had simply fallen for a trick, and was unable to understand this. Edward understood that in this situation it didn't matter anymore, and asked Vincent to help him and attack while he distracted the dragon. Vincent did not expect this monster to be so strong. Edward explained that this was why it was very difficult for him to attack this creature, and on top of that, they were on the ground while the dragon was hovering in the air. However, one of the brothers had previously heard that dragons had a weakness, which was their reverse scales. These scales were turned in the opposite direction from the other scale. That is why they decided that it would be best to use the shadow movement technique and rise up. The nameless dragon, apparently tired of just hovering in the air, decided to attack the brothers with his strength. The guys tried to dodge and hoped very much that they would manage to survive. The boy was angry that the dragon had somehow managed to drive away the shadow soldiers, and on top of that, attack them himself. They both tried with all their might to dodge the attack. However, not everyone managed to dodge, and Edward was badly hurt, which caused his brother great concern. Edward told his brother not to worry about him and to follow their plan, so Vincent used his demonic abilities and threw something like a spear at the dragon. The spear hit the nameless dragon but did not cause much damage, only angering the monster even more. Vincent was upset that he had not hit his target, but there was good news. The nameless dragon was no longer flying as high. Without thinking twice about his next move, the guy decided to use his shadow movement technique. He did this to get as close to the monster as possible, but he realized that he needed to aim a little higher. Vincent looked more closely and was able to spot the reverse scale, and now he knew exactly what to do next. The guy got closer and grabbed the reverse scale he intended to tear off with a strong grip. After several long minutes of effort, the guy finally managed to tear it off and was very happy. At that moment, Vincent saw a bright flash that looked like lightning, and he immediately realized that nothing good was coming. June stood in the shadows and watched the outcome of the battle closely, and judging by the actions of the brothers, he was only convinced of their stupidity. Edward ran up to his injured friend and tried to help him in any way he could. Vincent was sure they had already lost, but his brother tried to convince him otherwise and encourage him to believe in a positive outcome. The nameless dragon was still hovering in the sky, preparing to settle the score with these insolent men. June was sure that the brothers' problem was that they had touched the dragon's reverse scales without thinking about the consequences. He knew that newbies who encountered dragons for the first time often made this mistake, and then had to deal with the consequences. The reverse scales were, of course, the dragon's weak spot, and if one could locate them and attack, the effect would be unexpected. The dragon would only become more enraged, and the lives of those who decided to do so would certainly be in danger. The brothers were a good example of this, as something similar had happened to them, and ordinary items were of no help in this situation. Jun decided that this was the perfect time to take advantage of the situation. The guy just mentally asked the demons not to rush to send him to the other world, but instead to stall for time, so that he would have enough time to calmly pull back the bowstring.